All right. I am now joined by Conrad Hamilton and, of course, our friend Russell Sbriglia. We are in a few minutes going to be watching the 2017 debate between Slavoj Žižek and Graham Harman, which we've been kind of trying to alternate here for the Sunday night debate series between more directly political debates like the Christopher Hitchens, George Galloway, Iraq War one, and more philosophical debates like the Harris Shapiro free will thing that we did a couple weeks ago, or the Chomsky Foucault debate, which I guess is a mix of the two. So this is mostly on the philosophical side, although there's certainly political stuff that comes up in it. I want to let the guys introduce themselves in just a minute and introduce the topic a little bit. But first, I do want to plug a few things coming up. One, of course, is that the next episode of the show so that's going to be episode 24 is live tomorrow night at 7:30 Eastern. So the main guest there is going to be Michael Albert, one of the main thinkers behind what's sometimes called Paracon or participatory economics. Also, the delayed Vic Viana music segment after the technical difficulties last week should be happening tomorrow night, and we'll do a quick preview for the Thursday episode for patrons. That's episode 25, which is going to be the next installment in the monthly Sopranos recaps with Mike Racine, Nando Villa, and Big Waz. So we'll play a little preview for that tomorrow night. The one from last week with Dasha from Red Scare is up now for people on the Patreon. So would encourage anybody who does have the $5 who can swing it to do that. Get all that good extra content and of course help support the work that we do here, and hey everybody, which as a socialist I'm not big on uncompensated labor. So that's and I should also say that so next week for this Sunday debate series next week, Bhaskar Sankara is going to be on. I think we might be watching the capitalism socialism debate with Christopher Hitchens and some objectivists from the 90s. I'm not sure, but that should be fun. And for the Wednesday movie review live streams, doing something a little bit different this week. So it's going to be a follow up from the one. It's going to be a follow up from the one that we did a few weeks ago about Goodfellas. So with Micah Utrecht, the deputy editor from Jacobin, and of course our producer Forrest, and Daniel Bessner is also going to be on there. I think also Ryan Lake. So we all read the book Wise Guy that Goodfellas is based on. So we're going to do a little follow-up stream, talk a little bit about what they similarities and differences with the movie. So if you've seen the movie, it should be an interesting update. But that's enough for all of that. Right now, I want to get going in just a minute on the debate. So yeah, this is the same thing that we've been doing every Sunday. So we pick some old debate that's on YouTube and watch it together and give commentary on it. And I thought that Russ and Conrad would be really good people to do it with. There is a there's a pretty heavy there's a pretty heavy commentary bias here, which I certainly not going to deny, but I have actually much less of a dog in the fight than these guys do, and also some of this they'll be explaining to me, so should be interesting. But Conrad, you want to tell everybody who you are?
Sure. And should I progress to sort of framing the debate a little bit as well, or just stick to the introduction?
Stick to the introduction for now. We'll loop back and frame the debate.
Okay. Yep. I'm Conrad Hamilton. I'm currently a PhD student at Paris State University doing the revisions on my thesis, which deals with sort of the relationship between economic structure and agential categories in history, right? So, the idea that once women sort of enter the labor force, for example, that they become sort of metaphysical and jural subjects, right, in a way that's different than before, to simplify quite a bit. And I'm doing that with Catherine Malibu and Pierre Casonugez, but I'm also with Ben. I co-authored Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. Ben has a great chapter on rhetoric in that book, for those who haven't looked at it yet. And I collaborate with some different publishers like Zero Books and Haymarket Books. Hopefully in the future, I'll have the opportunity to publish my thesis as well.
Cool. Russ?
So I am an assistant professor of English at Seton Hall University in Jersey. I'm in an English department, although my field in English literature is primarily 19th century American literature, especially mid-century. So the classic American romantics like Emerson, Thoreau, Poe, Whitman, Melville. But I also teach and do research in critical theory and the sort of intersection of literature, philosophy, and psychoanalysis. And so, Ben, to your point earlier about speakers having an interest here or a position, cards on the table. So I am on good terms with Graham Harman. He and I are friends, but Žižek and I co-edited this volume titled Subject Lessons, Hegel, Lacan, and the Future of Materialism, and in which many of the philosophical and psychoanalytic concepts that are going to be debated here are debated in that volume. And in the interest of even fuller disclosure, Graham Harman wrote a review of it, and he was I thought it was pretty balanced. It wasn't a takedown or anything, but and he's critical of our position at various points. And Žižek and I are working on a response to that response. So I have a very, cards on the table. I have a very vested interest in this debate, and I just wanted to acknowledge that up front.
Yeah, and I should say also that the book that Conrad was just talking about that I just held up has an introduction, by Žižek. So all sorts of conflicts of interest all over the place here.
Well, I met Conrad. He and I met at in Ljubljana, Slovenia. It was August of 2019, which seems, as opposed to like a year and a half ago, like 10 years ago, but
100 years ago,
100 years ago. It was a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the University of Ljubljana, and so Žižek, along with the two other members that he calls his Slovenian troika, Mladen Dolar and Alenka Zupancic, had this week-long conference there, or summer school as they called it, and that's where so Conrad and I know each other from that.
Well, yeah, Russ, I want to add, Russ was, I think, quite instrumental in helping, set up the meeting, in which I think Žižek rather sort of reluctantly agreed to, quote, self-plagiarize and provide us with a forward. So that's very nice. And I guess I should add, since we're doing these disclosures, I should say that a few years ago, maybe it was 2016, I did have the opportunity to meet Graham Harman in Cairo, where he was teaching at the American University of Cairo, and discuss some of his ideas. So I'm not a Graham Harman scholar, if such a thing can be said to exist. But I want to say I do think that he's quite important to some of the transitions which have occurred in our philosophical culture. So I think, regardless of the exactitude of all of his propositions, I think probably in this debate I'm going to be defending some of his ideas a little bit too. So I know Russ is a bit on the other side. So
yeah, well, let's get into a little bit of what those ideas are. I think a lot of people watching this certainly know who Žižek is, and they're familiar with some of his political and cultural commentary. But I think probably a lot of people have less of a background in terms of the more philosophical side of his work. Would be my guess. and Harman, some people might not be familiar with it all. So if either one of you guys want to take this up, so before we get started, so Harman is associated with two things which are related, but speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. So somebody want to volunteer to do a sort of quick and dirty breakdown of what those things are?
Dude, I can take this one, or do you want to, Russ? What do you?
No, you can take you take this one, and then.
Okay, sure. Again, I'm going to risk approximation at times, right? Because I'm not writing a scholarly paper here. But so in 2007, there was a conference that was held at Goldsmiths in London, and the conference was called Speculative Realism, April 2007. Interestingly, just as the first signs of impending economic collapse were occurring, which I think is not coincidental, but I won't get into that here. But the conference was called Speculative Realism, a one-day workshop. And that conference included 4 speakers. There was most famously Quentin Meillassoux, but also Ray Brazier, Ian Hamilton Grant, and Graham Harman, and with moderation by Alberto Toscano, who's quite a name in his own right. So all the different presenters presented their ideas. And I think subsequently, because of the acclaim regarding the conference, saw their reputations enlarge. And this because of the sort of conjuncture of the conference, because it was rejecting, the postulate of correlationism, or the idea according to which reality has to be understood sort of in the interstices or correspondence of mind and world, right? As with Kant or various forms of transcendentally influenced philosophy. So again, all the presenters had different ideas, but Harman's signature, what's called object-oriented ontology, I would interpret, and perhaps Ross, you may be more versed in the minutiae, but I would interpret it as a sort of fusion of Latourian actor network theory with certain ideas culled from phenomenology. Right. So Bruno Latour is a French social scientist who's been publishing for some years. He recently retired. And one of Latour's most famous book is We Have Never Been Modern. Right. And in that book, Latour suggests that we need to advance beyond the sort of nature-society binary that has hitherto governed thought and understand the role that specific actants play in the structure of reality. So what Harman basically does is he takes the resources of phenomenology and tries to make this sort of anti-dualist, or I don't know how you'd portray it exactly, vitalistic in some respects. He might reject that adjective, but he tries to achieve that sort of shift with phenomenological resources. So we know in Husserl, for example, we have the sort of eidetic reduction, right, whereby objects emerge in consciousness in this way. But I think also very, very crucial for Harman is the idea that the Heideggerian tool analysis, right, whereby you only sort of notice an object at the moment at which it breaks, can be actually broadened to apply to the relationships between different objects themselves, right? That it doesn't have to purely refer to a relationship between, for instance, conscious human subjects and the objects that populate their environment, right?
So that's a pretty deep dive. Let's see if we can try to just distill a couple of the big parts of that. So certainly one thing I think that's important here is just so start off top by talking about speculative realism, just the realism that would that there are so there's a thriving debate that has existed in a lot of forms in the history of philosophy, and it certainly has forms that it takes in contemporary analytic philosophy and as well as continental philosophy about whether there's some important sense in which reality exists independently of perception or language or things like this. And so if speculative realism, and more specifically object-oriented ontology, is just about anything. Like presumably the beginning, without like before we even sort of do a deep dive into what the moves are, to get there, is at least being very strongly realist against philosophical background, where that's really not something that's at all taken for granted. And something that certainly knowing much less about this stuff than either of you guys do, I'm a philosophy nerd, but not exactly the right kind, is that one of the big things that object-oriented ontology is about is saying that we shouldn't see like human subjects as, in some important sense, philosophically primary, or sort of see the world as divided between human subjects and everything else, everything they might perceive or talk about, that in some really important way that we're just we're just objects like everything else, that that there's a whole world that's populated by all kinds of different objects, and humans, and even though there might be various things about us that are unique, are in some really important sense not special. So all of which, of course, my bias, I think, maybe coming out of a background where some of these claims might be a little less controversial, is to say, okay, that kind of sounds right, before you get into the deep dive. So Russ, and I'm going to have to get out for a minute, but I'm going to be listening. I'll hear what you say. Could you give us like a little bit of background on like the sort of controversial parts about it, and particularly how Žižek's views and maybe his Lacanianism sort of puts him in confrontation with this, like what the debate, at least between them, is about.
Yeah. So this is, well, there are a number of ways to approach this, and maybe, I guess, to set up the debate itself that we're going to watch is, well, there are a couple of things in relation to what Conrad said as well. Ben, what you were just describing, especially you'll see Harman's argument that even though human subjects may be have qualities or characteristics that are unique that other objects don't have, that he's trying to break outside of or away from the taxonomy, wherein he says 50% of ontology is granted to subjects, and everything else in the universe is the other 50%. And he claims that this is unwarranted, and that's kind of to flesh out this concept of correlationism that Conrad mentioned, which is a term that Quintin Meillassoux comes up with in his book, or foregrounds in his book After Finitude. And the finitude there refers to Kant. So you'll see that Kant comes up very early in Harman's remarks, because basically what we're dealing with here, to boil it down to the sort of simplest way to grasp it, and then I'll get into talking a little bit about where Žižek's position comes in, is that along with figures like Bruno Latour, who was mentioned, what Harman and others like Latour, Levi Bryant, who's also associated with object-oriented ontology, although less so today, they're coming from a position of what's usually referred to as flat ontology, which another figure in that orbit, Manuel Delanda, came up with. That's a term that he came up with, and that's basically the idea. Flat ontology is the most sort of unifying thread to describe what you were talking about just a minute ago, Ben, about human subjects being on par with other objects. So against this sort of horizontalization of the ontological plane, and the clearest example of this would be the old sort of Enlightenment concept of the great chain of being.
Right.
Human beings up God, but human beings at the top, animals, plant, and so on and so on, like this sort of very vertical hierarchical schema. And flat ontology is what it says. It's, I think Latour actually says it, says a horizontalizing of the ontological plane, where all beings are are equal. Levi Bryant calls this an ontological egalitarianism in his book, Democracy of Objects. And so Harman, you'll see, classifies himself as an object-oriented ontologist, and he'll argue that Žižek's position is a subject-oriented ontology, which I think it's a little bit more. I mean, the title of the book that Žižek and I edited is titled "Subject Lessons," so we are foregrounding the subject. But you'll see when you watch this that there's a lot more agreement between them than you would think. But the last thing I'll say is that whereas figures like Latour, Harman, Levi Bryant, another figure in this constellation would be Jane Bennett, who has this theory of new materialism or vibrant matter. Although, again, there are disagreements among all of these figures, but they do share the commitment to a flat ontology. The problem really is Kant and the idea that his notion of the thing in itself, which is inaccessible to human beings, that's human finitude. So Kant, Descartes a little bit is a villain too, but really Kant introduces this transcendental turn where the thing in itself is bracketed off from finite human beings. And that's, so you'll hear Harman use the term, modern philosophy or neo-modern philosophy. So modern or neo-modern philosophy is in the Kantian camp, and where Harman, Latour, and these other figures come from is sort of pre-modern. Not so much that Kant is a mistake, but we need to go back to a sort of pre-Kantian notion of ontology. So that's where you'll see the terms modern and pre-modern come up. That's specifically where it is. And Žižek is coming from a modern perspective through both German idealism, particularly the greatest post-Kantian Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, and through the psychoanalysis of Jacques Lacan. So that's, I think that's probably the easiest or clearest way to sort of set that up.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Look, let's get to it. Let's start up the beginning of it. It's not quite, there's some Q&A at the end, so it's not quite as long as it looks, but let's try to get through a decent little chunk of it, before if anybody has anything they want to shout out, and then feel free and we'll interrupt, but otherwise we'll try to get through a little chunk of it before we pause to talk about it. I should say, if people have questions, stick it in the super chat, and if it's more of a comment, we'll just stick it on the screen. But otherwise, we'll try to remember them and keep track of them to make sure we answer them later.
Please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Graham Harman.
How's the microphone? Can you all hear me fine? Slavoj has insisted tonight that we call him by his first name, and I'm going to try to force myself to do that. Usually I call famous authors by their family name because I've always worried about the borrowed glory of a false intimacy of calling somebody by first name, but we'll do as he asks. I used to tell my friends that Slavoj was the only philosopher I'd pay $100 to see live, and before tonight I had the chance to see him 5 times, and all of those were free. And this is number 6, and imagine my surprise to discover that Hernan removed $100 from my paycheck. Well, in some ways we're opposites. I'm an object-oriented philosopher, and you could call Slavoj one of the major subject-oriented philosophers, along with his compatriot, or his colleague, Alain Badiou. But there are some things that I really gravitate towards in his writing. First of all, I think philosophers should be funny. Too few of them are. And I would have to say that Slavoj is probably the first Western philosopher since Giordano Bruno in the 1500s who could probably have made a living as a stand-up comic if he had to. Now, of course, Bruno was burned at the stake in 1600. I doubt that's going to be Slavoj's fate, but in a different time, perhaps, you can imagine a situation where it could have gone that direction. Also, simply the animal energy of his writings and his public speaking. When I started graduate school in the early 1990s, there was a certain way of writing that I know he hates also, that involves putting everything in parentheses and quotation marks, and this is simply de-energizing and debilitating, and he avoids this wonderfully. He simply takes a stand on everything and challenges you to disagree. But here are some differences. You could say that Slavoj belongs to a modern tradition of philosophy, whereas I would say that I belong to what I call a non-modern tradition of philosophy that's more recent. I'm stealing that term non-modern from Bruno Latour. Slavoj would say that we are seeking a re-enchantment of the world after the alienation of modernity, whereas I would say the world was never disenchanted in the first place. We've always been fascinated by the world. We've always been entangled with it and involved with it. Another thing, an issue I have with modern philosophy is that modern philosophy is in many ways a taxonomy. It says there are at least two different kinds of beings, thought and world, or nature and spirit, or human and world. It starts by saying there are two totally different kinds of things, and they both need a different ontology to handle them properly. The human thought needs one kind of ontology, nature needs another ontology. Whereas, and by the way, I see this as an extension of the medieval taxonomy, which was between creator and created. There were two also basic kinds of things for medieval ontology. Whereas in non-modern philosophy, we start with what we call a flat ontology, which means we start off by assuming that everything has to be treated in the same terms. So we start off by assuming that the human being is simply an object like others. Yes, a very interesting object to us, an object that has lots of talents, perhaps, that chairs and tables do not, but an object nonetheless, and that you cannot start off by inscribing what's special about humans into the very foundation of philosophy. That has to come later. So you have to start off, this is why we give long lists a lot in object-oriented ontology. I'll say paper, grasshoppers, the planet Mars, chemicals, and so forth. You'll find 9 or 10 of these objects in a row. It's an attempt to create that sense of flattening for the reader. All right. There's also a kind of philosophy that I would call neo-modern philosophy, which I think it describes Slavoj's position a little more accurately. I should say that neo usually is taken as a derogatory prefix. If you call somebody neo something or other, it often means that you're just accusing them of rehashing the original version. That's not what I mean here. By neo-modern philosophy, I mean the kind that doesn't stay with a simple opposition between subject and object, but that tends to assimilate the object into the subject in some way. And so this starts with authors like Maimon and Fichte, the ones immediately after Kant, where Kant said there is a thing in itself out there that we can think about, but we can never know. These critiques of Kant tended to say that itself is a performative contradiction, because if you're thinking a thing outside thought, that itself is a thought, and therefore it makes no sense to talk about this thing in itself that's outside of thought. The thing in itself has to somehow be inscribed in the thought, the circle of thought already. You find a lot of this in Slavoj's work. You find it in Badiou's. You also find it in Conrad of my own generation. It also has an inverse, which I would call arch-modernism, which is where they're reducing the subject to the object, say to cognitive science, a way of trying to minimize the modern difference by letting science be the dominant discourse. And what Slavoj tells us in a number of his publications is that the way Hegel radicalized Kant by getting rid of the thing in itself is also the way that Lacan radicalized Freud. So that the unconscious in Freud is in some sense a real thing, a quasi-biological entity that's there, hidden beneath appearance. For Lacan, that's not really true. The unconscious occurs in the gaps and ruptures on the surface. There's not really a hidden place where the unconscious is. Now, what I would say is that neo-modern philosophy radicalizes Kant in the wrong way. It tends to say that the problem with Kant, this great genius, is that he allowed for finitude, this idea that humans cannot reach the thing in itself because we are only experiencing according to space-time and the 12 categories of the understanding, and so we can never get at the thing outside there. And the neo-modern philosophers tend to try to get rid of this finitude, which they distrust. I would go the other way. I think the finitude is insurmountable. I think the problem with Kant is that he left the human-world relation at the center of philosophy, and it's the only real relation he can talk about. Kant doesn't really allow you to talk about the collision of two inanimate entities, except insofar as we are talking about it, and therefore the conditions of human experience apply to discussing that. So I think what should have happened is people should have said Kant is a genius precisely because of the finitude. He just shouldn't have reduced it to the human-world gap, so that we poor humans can't reach the end itself. It's a problem of the subject, of the human being. For me, the same problem happens when inanimate objects collide. To take the old example from Islamic philosophy, when fire burns cotton, the fire is not making contact with all the properties of the cotton, but only with a caricature or a translation or a distortion of the cotton. And so there's no direct contact possible in the inanimate world either, and so the same problem that happens in the subject happens in the inanimate world as well. This is one of the central principles of O, as we call object-oriented ontology. So if you want to speak about this counterfactually in terms of the history of philosophy, instead of a German idealism, there could have been a German realism at that same moment that took the path I've just sketched. And it was quite plausible because German philosophy at the time was very much under the influence of Leibniz. And Leibniz also allows for this world of non-human things mirroring each other and reflecting each other. This could have happened. So in a way, Triple O is just trying to create German idealism 200 years after it first could have been born. All right, now realism. This is another probable difference between us. I know Slavoj doesn't like being called an idealist always, but he certainly wouldn't call himself a realist, I don't think. Realism is sometimes also called naive realism, as if there were other kinds, according to these critics. They think all the realism is naive. And this means, according to them, the idea that there's a reality outside the mind, that the mind has nothing to do with constructing. I think that's the wrong way to define naive realism.
Very small point. I do want to just jump in on that. At least in the tradition that I'm most aware of, that's not exactly what naive realism means. So, naive realism as is a specific kind of realism, right? So if you're a realist, you think that there are these objects, outside of the human mind, and the distinction between naive realism and like indirect realism maybe has to do with whether what we're perceiving is the object itself or something else. So if you think back to Descartes or Locke, people like this, they thought that that what you were actually, or even some people in the early 20th century, they thought that what you were perceiving was something called sense data, which is, you can almost think of as like a photograph of the object taken by your mind, something like that. So when you see that it's not exactly that, that when I hold up my fingers, you're seeing the fingers, you're seeing some a bit of sense data in your visual field. This is like one way of putting it, and so you're perceiving something that's caused by the actual object as opposed to directly perceiving the object. So at least as I've always understood, we can, I'm sure people who are experts on various thinkers, I just rattled off, can nitpick, but whatever. That's at least a widespread perception of way of understanding what a lot of people, a lot of historical philosophers have thought, as opposed to naive realism, which I know naive sounds pejorative, but it's not necessarily, but in context, it's not necessarily pejorative, but just naive. What made naive in the sense of being what most people pre-philosophically think, which is just that we're what you're perceiving are the fingers, that what you're making contact with is the object itself.
Yeah, Ben, can I just jump? I think that's absolutely right. The best example of naive realism that I can think of comes from Dr. Samuel Johnson in Boswell's Life of Johnson. They're talking about these Scottish philosophers, Scottish common sense philosophy like James Beattie, but also the Irish philosopher Bishop George Berkeley, who's in the Lockean tradition, and Boswell, the author of The Life of Johnson, asks Johnson, I think they're talking about having seen a lecture or read a lecture by either Beattie or Berkeley. And Boswell's like, how can you possibly, how can you possibly refute this? And they're just walking along and there's a big stone or a boulder or what, and Boswell says, I refute Berkeley thus, and he kicks the stone. And that would be, I think, a quintessential example of naive realism, where there's no mediation. The point that he's making there between, there's the thing out there in the world, and then there's the representation of it to our minds, right, that we're seeing. And Johnson's point is like, no, like I'm making direct contact with reality itself.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, yeah, Berkeley is is British empiricist, interesting slip, British empiricist, but he's also an idealist. So he's somebody who actually has this sort of this view that objects are really like all that exists are minds, whether our minds or God's mind, and what we think of as external objects are really just such certain kinds of regularities of experience that are that are established by God, And so yeah, the point is I've always gotten it of the rock kicking is that it's just a sort of basic rejection, not just of that view, but of the view that, okay, well, there are certain kinds of, like, we're maybe experiencing this sense data, and then it's a big mystery whether there's like a real object underneath the sense data, and it's like, no, screw you, like there are clearly objects. Here's one. All right. Sorry, Conrad, you're muted if you want to throw something in.
Yeah.
I got you. Sorry.
I think actually, I think Ayn Rand uses that same argument against Kant in one of her essays. I forget which one, but she says, like, if someone came along, with a stick and just hit him with it, he would realize that this sort of elaborate, mediation that he describes, is not valid. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I thought it was funny.
Yeah, that's funny.
I didn't think I could like Kant anymore, but now.
Yeah, which is, I mean, I also wouldn't. I mean, I think that Ayn Rand, I really wouldn't trust to, like, I mean, this is going to sound like kind of a, like, I don't know, ivory tower elitist comment, but like really deeply, like I would not trust to know what Kant's talking about, because if you and which I would apply in general, because if you read like Ayn Rand stuff about ethics, and she's describing all of previous philosophy, before herself, and she'll go on about how well, basically there was Aristotle who's good, there's Ayn Rand who's good, and in between them there's something called altruism, which says that anything that you're doing for other people is good, anything you're doing for yourself is bad. And all I could think when I read this is hold on, the Kant, like if you've only read like one thing by Kant, it's it's probably the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, because that's what's assigned in like introductory classes, and it's about this thick, and in it he's laying out his moral theory, and he has like 4 examples of things that would violate the categorical imperative, and 2 of them are about duties to yourself. And so, and this is just like, one of them's the guy who doesn't develop his talents, and the other one's somebody who is considering committed suicide because they don't think life is worth living. And whatever you think about all of that, like, okay, whatever, like clearly one of the most important thinkers in the certainly the history of modern philosophy, not the history of philosophy period, in his most accessible work, has a view that just doesn't fit what you say is like the overwhelming dominant view for hundreds and hundreds of years, whatever. And so like this is just like, whatever you think of Kant or Kantianism or categorical imperative or anything like that, it's just a weird thing that she doesn't engage with this at all.
Yeah, it was tough back then. They didn't have Google. They didn't have they didn't have Control F. Ben, it was hard back then.
Fair enough. All right.
I think naive realism is the kind of realism that thinks there's a world outside the mind and I can know it. That's the first problem, because I think the real is so real that it cannot be known. It can be gotten at indirectly. It's not completely inaccessible, but it's inaccessible only through what I call allure. Something is summoning you, something is drawing you, with aesthetics being a very clear case of that. Something is summoning you without being directly accessible. That's one problem with what they call naive realism. Adrian Johnston, who among many other things is one of the best interpreters of Slavoj that we have, claims that I will be left with nothing but negative theology if I take this path. But that assumes that there's only 2 options. You either know something or you don't. Whereas this is what is called Meno's paradox. This is what Socrates criticizes, the idea that you already know something or you don't. I think the truth is that we are somewhere in between those. And this is the foundation for philosophia in the Greek meaning of it, that it's a love of wisdom. You never attain the wisdom. You're always somewhere in between there. And I think also this is what aesthetics is about. Aesthetics is not a kind of knowledge any more than philosophy is. And this holds for architecture as well as the arts. You obviously make use of knowledge in architecture, just as we do in philosophy, but you are not primarily producing knowledge. That's a side effect in most of what you're doing in architecture. You're producing something else. You're producing something that's not ever fully knowable, not ever fully paraphrasable in literal terms, in terms of, you can say literally what the 25 qualities of this building are. You can try that, but it's never going to work. So aesthetics is very central for Triple O. And how am I doing on time, Anna? Fine? Okay. Here's another problem I have with naive realism. People always say realism is the view that something exists outside the mind. Who says that the mind is the only thing with an outside? There's an outside also when two objects interact. And I say that there's a reality outside of that interaction. When the fire burns the cotton, there's a cotton outside of what the fire interacts with. And so realism is something that affects not just us, something outside our mind. It implies also something outside of objects when they interact. So objects translate each other, just as we translate them. Alfred North Whitehead got a glimpse of this in his wonderful sort of throwback philosophy in the 1920s. But Whitehead, for me, is too relational. He reduces objects to their relations with other things, whereas O is all about the irreducibility of objects to their relations. So what is an example where Slavoj seems to be an anti-realist? I'll take one of my favorite examples from The Sublime Object of Ideology, which was not his first book, but his breakthrough book, the book that really made him known to a wide audience, from 1989. And that is his very interesting remarks on anti-Semitism. He makes there a very interesting claim that if somebody just says Jews conspire and manipulate, that's not quite anti-Semitism yet. The anti-Semitism is the next step, where you say they conspire and manipulate because they're Jews. In other words, there's some hidden essential core that's causing the conspiracies and manipulation. Fascinating idea, but I would put it somewhat differently. It sounds there like he's saying that the mistake is in saying that Jewishness is some sort of real entity outside of all the individual cases. Now, if an anti-Semite were to make anti-Semitic remarks, you would, of course, say you shouldn't generalize, right? Jews are individual people, each with their own qualities and traits, and you can't generalize about a whole group. That is something you would and should say. However, I would take a different tack in responding to the anti-Semite. I would say that you cannot know what that essence is. And I'm going to show this by making a parallel critique of Edward Said. Edward Said, I could never say anything against him in Cairo because he was a kind of saint on campus. And I was very happy to have a major person writing in the US media defending the Palestinian side. But there's a problem with his major book, Orientalism. Several problems, but the problem I'm going to talk about here is at one point in the book, he relies on the argument that you can't generalize about the Orient. And of course, Orient's too big a term in its colonialist use. It referred to the Middle East and to the Far East and so forth. But leaving that aside, he says at one point in the book that you can't generalize, everybody's an individual, right? There are just a lot of individuals in the Middle East. You can't make a sweeping statement about what the Orient is. But it occurred to me that that is close to the ontology of Margaret Thatcher, who says that society doesn't exist. There's only families and individuals. And the fact is, we do try to learn things about culture as a whole. When I went to Egypt for the first time in 2000, there were a lot of things I had to learn about Middle Eastern culture. You can put your foot in your mouth if you don't. You have to learn a lot of things about what can be said, what can't be said. One of my students in Cairo who spoke fluent English had a night job telemarketing to the US, and he had to take a culture course about Americans. So I got to see that in reverse, and it was hilarious. They taught him you can't ask Americans if they're married, you can't ask them their salary, all things that are very normal for a taxi driver in Cairo to ask you. So it wouldn't make much sense to say that there's no such thing as Egyptian culture or Middle Eastern culture. You should be able to say something about it. I think the problem with Orientalism and the problem with essentialism comes when somebody claims to know it. So in other words, it's not Orientalist to say Egyptian culture is different in some ways from English culture. The problem comes when you say, we know that the Middle Eastern peoples are incapable of self-rule, and therefore they need a viceroy to come from Europe and command them. This is where the anti-Semitism, the racism, the bad essentialism come in. I don't think there's a problem with essence as such. And I think one of the problems with recent theory is it's been too suspicious of the notion of essence. It takes away the realist part of theory. Because if everything has its own character, then everything has an essence for that very reason. It's a changeable essence maybe, but it's an essence. And in fact, this is how Aristotle defines substance. Substance, another much beleaguered concept today in contemporary philosophy. The most interesting definition Aristotle gives of substance is it's the thing that can have different qualities at different times. So white is always white and sad is always sad, but Socrates can be happy one minute and sad the next. That's what makes him a substance. The most interesting human characters are often capable of different polarizations of personality at different times. The famous sinner-saint polarity. You've got Paul, who's the persecutor of the Christians and then becomes the apostle of the Christians. And I've always been fascinated by the example of Scandinavia, now known for the most humane social democracy in Europe, but they were once the marauding Vikings. So what's the proper reaction to that? I don't think it would be to say necessarily there is no essence to Scandinavian civilization. It probably means that there is, but it's something deeper than either marauding or social democracy. Those are surface properties. And we might get into this if we come to quantum theory lately, which I know Slavoj likes a lot. All right, so let me just, if I have time for
Hey, Ben.
brief remarks before I wrap it up? Okay. All right.
We just, yeah.
Now, one issue that's going to come up tonight is that objects from.
Yeah, I think I think there's something being, I don't want to say lost in translation here, but I don't agree with Harman here, because I think that the point that he's trying to make, well, let me see. I think that I was just taking notes while he was saying this. He's arguing that the problem with something like anti-Semitism or Orientalism, like, anti-Arab sentiment, is that the problem is claiming to know it. But I think that what he's doing there is casting that as a problem of epistemology, like knowledge. But I think that to the way that Žižek gives the example there of anti-Semitism, the anti-Semite, for them, they would never say it's an ontological problem, but it's on the level of being, right? It's that there's something. This is true of any essentialism. There's something in Jews, or the figure of the Jew, that makes them this way. And I don't think that, I don't think that you can just say, of course, nobody would say that there's no such thing as Jewish culture or I mean, like he said, or Oriental is, I mean, not only is that, no longer politically correct, but there, or like, let's say like Eastern culture or something like that. Of course there are, the example he gave of being in Cairo, right? Like, you can't act as the way you would as an American and not, practice some degree of assimilation or deference to a particular culture. But I think that he's kind of obfuscating the problem a little bit here, because the issue of anti-Semitism is Jews are this at the individual level, not the level of a Jewish culture.
Yeah. And what we're talking about, right, is this, because of course there are going to be, I mean, you can make statistical generalizations. You can say that there are, and sure, I mean, culture exists. Although I also think, like, I guess I am a little bit of a dogmatic materialist about this. Like, I get really, like, my hackles really get up, whenever I encounter somebody who thinks that it's going to have this like massive explanatory value in all sorts of different contexts. I get. I don't like that. But look, I mean, culture exists, but it's also, I think it's kind of funny if you think about his Cairo example side by side with his Norway example, because the kinds of things that he's talking about in Cairo are going to be sure that in different cultures you have different mores, different things are considered, polite or impolite. But that's pretty surface level stuff, and it's stuff that presumably changes a lot over time. And I mean, I want to know how many I want to know how many politeness norms the Vikings had in common with modern Norwegians, and that's that's maybe a little superficial. But then but then I think the point where, because like there's a point early on where it seems like Harman's just making this like kind of very like narrow technical point that, okay, if we think we can use terms like Norwegian or Egyptian, then the Jew, then then there's some sort of bare sense in which there's some kind of essence there, because there are things that would make us consider people part of the category or not part of the category. But then it seems, and like on that level, it's like, sure, I guess, right, But then it does seem like he's veering into essentialism of a kind that I'd be super skeptical about when he says that, oh, I want, like there's going to be some essence of Norwegianness that goes so deep that, that it's going to, like it's at a prior level to, being marauding Vikings versus being, 20th century social democrats. As like, really? Like, like, I mean, I think that like, I don't know. I'm pretty skeptical, like, other than, I'm pretty skeptical of the deep commonalities between anybody who's in this, who comes out of this nation or culture, over the course of this incredibly long period of time, that those are really going to be all that interesting or informative.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think this gets us actually to their, like, you can see this is really a difference that indexes to their own respective philosophical stances. Because Harman, for his system to function, he has to isolate objects, right? That's a condition of its functioning. And again, we could look to sort of historical antecedents, right? Like, sort of the eidetic reduction of Husserl and essences. Whereas Žižek is above all a dialectical thinker, right? I think Lukács quotes this, but somewhere Hegel says something like, anything that is deep or profound is meaningless, right? For that very reason. And it seems like quite a provocation today. But I think his point is that, if you're trying to isolate some kind of, trans-historical essence, right, or eternal essence, as it were, that's outside of the dialectic, that doesn't have a sort of provisional existence, that you're already ignoring sort of like the flux which everything exists within, right? Everything being temporally conditioned in some sense or another, right? So I think Ben, you're on the right path, and it definitely tells us a lot about their angles,
Yeah, and it's also, I don't know, like I wonder how much he has to make this particular move here, because, you could think, look, there are lots of, it doesn't have to be all or nothing here, right? There are lots of objects that really do exist and might exist separately in some sense. I know, like, trying to like really figure out what we mean by separately gets very complicated very quickly, but intuitively that might be separate in some sense from from perception or the way we talk about them. But like, I don't know. I mean, do you really need these sort of like racial or national categories, to be, to be on that list? And that just, I don't know. Like, I have if so, I'll at least say that makes me much less friendly to the project, because I think, I don't know. I mean, like, I feel like, the beginning of wisdom is, like what like you learn from like Adolf or Victoria Reed about like why racial essentialism is stupid, and that's not. And I'm suspicious of how much you have captured that, if all you're saying is that there's an essence there, but it's deep and mysterious and unknowable.
Yeah, I think more than anything else, because you'll like they come back to this because Žižek takes it up, the question of his theory of anti-Semitism in the sublime object of ideology, or his sort of glossing of it. But yeah, it struck me as strange, I think, more than anything else, that's the move that he made there to try to illustrate that point. But
yeah, fair enough. All right, let's go. See if we can watch a little more here.
For me, are non-relational. Objects are that which resist any reduction to their components or to their outward effects. And so objects for me are non-relational. And I know sometimes Slavoj seems to agree with that, as when he was reading my immaterialism book recently, but sometimes he talks, when he's writing against Levi Bryant, he said that the subject is nothing but a pure network of relations. So I want to hear what he says about that. Architecturally, there is an implication here, and I'll refer to Patrick Schumacher again. In his huge manifesto, 2-volume Autopoiesis of Architecture, which I learned a lot from actually as a newcomer to architecture, he borrows Luhmann's terminology and says that architecture is about framing social communications. I think it cannot be that, or it cannot be just that. You're not creating communication, you're also creating non-communication. You're making discrete things with an inside, and that inside does not completely communicate with the outside. So architecture has to be, at least in large part, about non-communication. And one of my favorite moments in Patrick's book is when he says, every architectural theory has its vices, and I have to admit my vice is I don't know where to put the doors and windows, because everything's supposed to be a gradient and flowing naturally, and so it becomes kind of arbitrary way to articulate the building. And I think that's a serious problem. And David Rue, in a very nice piece that he wrote in TARP, Architectural Manual, a few years ago, talked about the worry that with the excessive concern with how the building flows into its environments gradually, gently, without any discernible break-off, that architecture could blend into ecology and disappear, that everything could become about the carbon footprint, and there could be no autonomy to the discipline. So I would worry about bringing too much relationality into architecture. And another way that relationality is usually brought into a lot of fields is to bring the socio-political relationality into it. Now, I'm not enough of a formalist to say that an aesthetic work cannot communicate with any of the socio-political circumstances. Of course it can, and there are obvious examples like Uncle Tom's Cabin or Picasso's, the list goes on. However, I don't think that they arbitrarily include everything in their environment. It's just a very selective process by which an object assimilates influences from its environments, and we have to know more about how that process occurs before we simply shoot the moon and say everything's social and political. There's nothing outside of ideology. There's nothing outside of politics. So I guess I will leave it there. Thank you. Hope that wasn't too long.
Does it work? I hope it works also.
It works.
Yeah, okay. I see a problem today. I mean, the topic you indicated is so fundamental that I have no illusions that we will arrive at. It would be a great success if we just somehow clarify where the difference really is. Because I think the biggest problem in so-called philosophical dialogues, it's not who is right, but in what does the difference reside in the first place. And here I'm pretty much a pessimist. I think the entire history of philosophy is a history of one guy allegedly superseding the other, but really misreading him. For example, as an old Plato admirer, I claim it's clear how Aristotle misread Plato, or to go later, it's clear that Kant misread Leibniz and the previous philosophers. Fichte, Schelling misread Kant, Hegel misread all of them. My favorite example, if any guy didn't understand Hegel, it was Marx, and so on and so on. So let's just be modest, and I will just try to mark some differences. There are so many things to say. First, already beginning with that Latour thesis, we were never modern and so on. I'm here a naive, I admit it openly, a naive believer in modernity. I claim that, that with modernity, something happens at the level of science, modern science, at the level of politics, at the level of subjectivity and so on, which simply cannot be dismissed as just another form of enchantment and so on and so on. Just look at politics, whatever doubts we do have, but the whole political vision of French Revolution is something radically new. That's just one point on which I would insist. Then let's go on. Maybe one of the differences that we have is, although you have some sympathy for Heidegger, but if there ever was a thinker, I claim, who is radically historicist and transcendental, it's Heidegger. Here I never got your reference to quadruple objects, how you link it with Heidegger, because when Heidegger speaks about das Geviert, the quadruple, his point is, of course, not in the usual Kantian sense, but in more radical sense, transcendental. What do I mean by transcendental? It's simply the idea that because of our finitude, we never speak from a void. We are always thrown into certain pre-understanding of the world, which is always, they like, transcendental thinkers did phrase, always already here. You never encounter, as you know very well, you never encounter simply things the way they are. You always approach them from a certain historically specific horizon. And for Heidegger, Germans have this beautiful term, unhintergehbar, what you cannot step behind. For example, for Heidegger, each epoch is characterized by a certain disclosure of being. In modernity, objects, what is really objective is just object of science, quantifiable, all other things are subjective expressions, and so on and so on. In medieval times, reality appeared in a different way, and so on and so on. Now, what I agree with, where I do agree with you, is that we should step beyond the transcendental circle, this circle of always already, simply is not strong enough to confront us with today's problems. Let me take the one who is for me the ultimate transcendentalist, Jürgen Habermas. when we have the threat that biogenetics will objectivize us, he pulls a simple Habermas, a simple transcendental trick. His reasoning is, but even if I objectify you as a neuronal mechanism, in doing this, I already presuppose certain rational argumentation and so on, which is a priori here, which cannot be itself objectivized in this way. So, whichever way we approach reality, a transcendental horizon is here. And to be slightly sarcastic, that's how Habermas ended up doing a book together with Ratzinger, with the Pope, you know, rejecting biogenetics. So, again, I think that transcendental approach is something very harsh, and one can even read you in a loving way, not critically. Your works as transcendental in the sense that, for example, you're wonderful and your ontology is very powerful. Description of reality, it's a certain vision that is simply here and you describe. It's a kind of a priori. It's not that you just look at the world and, oh my God, you discovered it is like this. And I agree with you. Here we also agree that, and here we are all followers of Quentin Meillassoux, that the transcendental dimension shouldn't be the last horizon, because then you end in this Heideggerian deadlock. We just have a succession of different transcendental horizons and so on and so on. So here I would say the transcendental problem is much stronger. But let's go on more interesting topics. I like what you said. It's a wonderful formulation about how it's not only either subjectivism, we constitute reality, or reality is out there unknowable, or reality is out there we can know it. My position would have been here, the fourth one, maybe more subtle. Yes, I agree with you. Reality is out there impenetrable. We cannot ever fully get at it. What I would have done, and probably you would disagree, is to add an additional, sorry for the implicit obscenity, turn of the screw, and to add that I always was fascinated by this wonderful saying of Hegel. It's not literally like this, but more or less he says it, that the secrets of the Egyptians were also the secrets for the Egyptians themselves. That is to say, I don't think there is a reality in itself which is just impenetrable to us. What if, and that's how in my naive way I read one of the lessons of quantum physics, what if this impenetrability is, and I mean this in the most radical sense imaginable, a feature of reality itself. Reality is not just out there, we cannot get at it. Reality is in itself flawed, imperfect, antagonistic. It's incomplete in itself. That's why, if I can tell another story, probably you know it, which I love it, the best quantum physics joke. I read this in some simple introduction to philosophy. It's my favorite philosophical narrative. The idea is this one, to understand, and this is the big conflict in philosophy, what are the ontological consequences of quantum physics? They claim, imagine a video game. You move in it, and you see some trees in the background, a forest. You cannot go there and see the forest, the trees from close up, because simply the game is not programmed in this way. If you come too close to the trees, you just see some vague dots, contours. Why? Because it's not part of the game, universe the way it's constructed, that you can go there. So in this wonderful reading, that I like, it goes on like this, that the lesson of quantum physics is that God constructed our world like a lazy computer designer. He said, oh, in the same way that in a computer game, you know, it happens on a certain field where you kill Pokemons, fight, whatever, but you are not meant to go back close to that door, or the house, just the outside is constructed, because, so why should God lose time constructing the inside? And the idea, it's a wonderful, ironic idea, it's a good philosophy, is that we, as it were, caught God with his pants down. God thought, that's this ironic reading of quantum physics, God thought, oh, these stupid humans will never go beyond the structure of atom. So we can leave it ontologically incomplete. Why should I lose time constructing? But we were a little bit too bright for God. You know, we went there and we found indeterminacy and so on and so on. And that's the big difference between Heisenberg and Bohr. Heisenberg still thought that indeterminacy is just epistemological. We cannot have it both ways, velocity and position, but in themselves, particles have both properties. Bohr goes further, they don't have. So that would be my, as it were, addition, that this imperfection is part of reality itself. Reality in itself is, in this sense, imperfect. It's not that there is full reality out there, we just don't get it. I mean, I'm not denying that there are aspects which are unknown to us and so on, but that, again, imperfection is out there. The second thing I would add here, I mean, I'm so sorry, stop me when I speak to you because I have so many things to say. Okay, let's not get lost here. Let's go to the topic of subject. I always think, maybe I am wrong, that the problem with O is for me that, okay, it's easy to say subject is ultimately just another object. In a certain way, of course it is. I mean, we don't exist without bodily substance and so on and so on. But what I would have said is that modern subjectivity is not simply a meta-actant, meta-agent, like an object which or who doesn't want to be just an object but wants to posit the entire world and so on and so on. Subject is, for me, I don't have time to go into it, it's a complex topic, something much more paradoxically, it's more an impassive entity. It's, in a way, this failure, lack of being, in a way, coming out to be existing. Which is why subject for me is not an all-powerful agent. It's just a certain, at its most fundamental, subject is for me a certain, if you want to, structural deadlock, impossibility, passivity. What do I mean by this? Let me go on here. For Lacan, subject does have always an object that it is. It's just that the paradox of subject is that the subject is an object unavailable to itself. To be a subject means radically not to know what for an object I am. And it's not just this, it's that this surplus of not knowing has to be embodied in an additional paradoxical object called by Lacan object small a, the object call of desire, and so on, which is why I will talk too much, I'm afraid, which is why for Lacan, you know, when people think, oh, for psychoanalysis, object of desire is forever eluding. Yes, but that object is not out there, I cannot ever reach it. That object is myself. Subject, which is why for Lacan, the ultimate subject in sex terms is a woman with this eternal hysterical question, tell me why you love me. It means tell me what for an object I am, but of course you cannot ever answer it. Object, the true enigma, psychoanalysis has here a wonderful theory of subjectivity. The true enigma is a small child, he or she sees that he or she is manipulated by parents, they want something from you, they play their traumas through you, but it's never clear to you what they want from you, what you are for them. This abyss defines the subject. So subject is not mega strong, subject is, I agree with you, this is my scene for you, not one among the objects, but not in the sense of we have an objective world and look, that crappy human being wants to be everything. No, subject is for me rather an effect of limitation, Subject means we are in certain horizon, we cannot move beyond. Now I come to another crucial point. I wonder if you would agree. Reality, real. Here, and I find an echo with what you were saying about this, how the thing in itself, it's not that it's out there and then all this naive, in the bad sense, topic, can we grab it or not? We can, but not directly. We can grab it through the very structure of failures to get at it. And if you allow me to conclude slowly, then I have just one more remark to give you an example which I used maybe about 10 times in my books, but I think it's a perfect one. From Lévi-Strauss, in one of his best essays in his Structural Anthropology, Do Dual Organizations Exist? Lévi-Strauss reports of his experience in with some, I think it's even North American, Indian, Native American. I hate the term; it's more racist, I think, than Indian. I spoke with my Indian friends; they all tell me the same thing. I much prefer to be called Indian than Native American. If I'm Native American, means what? And you are cultural American, same nature. If I'm Indian, called, at least my name is a monument to white man's stupidity. So who thought they are in India? So what I'm saying is that this is what Lévi-Strauss reports on. He went to a certain village and asked the people there, inhabitants, tribal village, draw me the map of your village. And he noticed that he got two totally different drawings. One was a kind of a hierarchy concentric, the sanctuary with all the rich people's huts and so on in center, and ordinary members around. The other one was more dualist, rich ruling priests on the one side, the other. So, but then his idea was, but it's simple to establish what is reality. You take a helicopter, you took a photo, and you see how houses are really disposed. So in this sense, you can compare these wrong images with reality. And you can get at it that none of them fits. But then Lévi-Strauss says something wonderful. He says, the point is not that these two images don't fit reality. Their truth is in the way they miss reality. Because in the gap that separates these two images, this very gap, this failure to represent properly social reality, tells you the deepest truth about social reality. That it was class society at its beginning, these two drawings, which both falsify social edifice, register the growing social antagonism. So you see how, although none of them fits reality, the truth is the social antagonism which is registered in this very failure. And coming back to anti-Semitism, that's why I love Lacan's saying, I again often use it, that, I'm sorry, it's a little bit male chauvinist, I could provide to you another version, that if we have a pathologically jealous husband, and even if all his suspicions are true, his wife is sleeping around, blah, blah, his jealousy is still pathological. Because the true point is not, are my obsessions about my wife true or not? The true point is, why do I need this pathological jealousy to maintain my identity? And I claim that would be my approach. It's exactly the same with anti-Semitism. If, let's say, I'm in Germany in 1935, I want to debate with okay, not Nazi friend of mine, Nazi guy, the truth about anti-Semitism. The moment I limit the debate to, are Jews really like that, the way you claim, I'm lost. Because if you approach it in this way, the result would be a compromise. Yes, maybe you anti-Semites exaggerate a little bit, but you have a point. Like anti-Semites claim Jews exploit us Germans. Well, up to a point, this was definitely true. Many Jews were rich in a formal sense, they did it. Jews seduce our girls. Well, I hope they did, and I hope the other way around. And you know what I mean? What makes Nazi anti-Semitism pathological is not, is it true or not, what they claim about the Jews. It is, why do they need anti-Semitism to assert their identity, their political vision, and so on and so on? And here I would define truth as opposed to simple knowledge. At the level of simple knowledge, you ask, anti-Semitism claims this, that, is it true or not? But okay, that's the next point. Now to conclude, yeah, immediately. Just one more point, because I have many others. Surprisingly, where we do agree, as we already established, is that I'm also like you, and it may be surprising to some of you, totally on your side against this absolutely predominant doxa today. Whenever you have a debate, I agree with you on the one hand, as you pointed out about Egypt. I mean, this cheap historicism in the sense of, you know, whenever, that's one safe strategy in today's thinking, whenever you have a principled debate and you are losing, if you take recourse to this cheap historicism. Like, I've been to many feminist debates where the side which was losing said, but wait a minute, woman doesn't exist. There are only prostitutes, wives, single mothers, which, you know, this cheap relativization, particularization. I totally agree with you. Universality has a certain actuality and so on. Second point, where I agree with you, is this immobilism, because the other doxa of today is things are dynamic, every fixation, every fixed identity is something which is just a temporary reification, fixation. No, I agree with your wonderful formulas where you claim that, in a way, identity precedes activity. I just would give to it maybe a further twist so that I don't lose time now. Let's go to your key point, reduction of objects to relations. What would you go as far? Maybe here is the understanding. I agree with you, objects cannot be reduced to a set of relations, especially actual relations. There is always an excess. But I claim, nonetheless, this excess can be generated through relations. Let me take an example similar to your East India Company. Let's take communism. It's a cause, which it is totally clear that communism as a cause, and I'm very critical towards it, although I still consider myself a communist, communism as a cause exists only insofar as it is practiced, actualized, debated among humans. It is this paradoxical entity, all social causes are like this. They exist only through incessant activity of individuals. But nonetheless, I agree with you, they cannot be reduced to it. That would be my paradox. They can totally depend on relations, but they have an excess. For example, it is, where would be the in itself of communism? Although communism began as the idea of equality, transparency, and so on, it's totally legitimate to ask the question, but isn't there another hidden side of communism? Was Stalinist deviation really just a secondary mistake, or was it an actualization of something that was already originally possible in the idea of communism, and so on and so on? So I don't get it. For example, let's take a case of communism. Isn't it something that, although it is fully rooted in relations, it is alive as an idea only insofar as people debate it, fight for it, and so on, it still has an in itself. But it's a paradoxical in itself, which, again, that's the paradox I would insist on. It doesn't exist outside relations, but it's posited by relations themselves as there in itself, as something transcendent, getting over them, and so on and so on. Okay, I have many other things to say. I will not now lose time. For example, when you mentioned objectivity and so on.
Slavoj, I'm going to interrupt.
I already told her before that he should act as if she is a domina with a black leg, and you are now whipping me, and I agree. Okay, I stop. Sorry.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I liked that. One of 3 or 4 times that he was starting to wrap up ago, he said, "One more thing. I have many points." But,
Yeah.
that's which would be a good alternate title for the video. But yeah, any thoughts about Žižek's opening presentation here?
Ross, you
Well,
can go ahead if you want. Yeah.
There's a lot there. First of all, let's see. I was just sort of like scrambling notes. So as you saw, they agree on certain things up to a certain point. And I think what the main sort of difference between their two positions is that, well, here they agree on the need to, or a desire to, move beyond the transcendental circle, which is beyond correlationism, beyond the idea that we can never have access to reality as it is in itself because of human finitude. So, but what's funny is that Harman's argument, his critique of Žižek's position and of mine in our book, is that we're actually guilty of correlationism because we define the subject and object in relation to one another. So that's where, and we are arguing against that. I can talk more about that later, but just to gloss a couple of other things that he said, the idea that reality in itself is incomplete, right? So this, I think, is crucial because for Harman may assume, although Harman's saying here that there's much, he admires Kant very much. He just wishes that the turn after Kant would have been for a German realism as opposed to a German idealism. But the move here that Žižek is making when he says reality is incomplete in itself is, right, for Kant, we come up against these antinomies of reason. And part of this is because of, well, not part of it, it's because of our very finitude, that we can't access the thing in itself, reality as it is. And that posits that there's some sort of positive noumenal transcendental realm beyond what exists, beyond our material, Kant would say, phenomenal reality. And Hegel's point is that the antinomies of reason, it's not so much because of our finitude, but it's because that shows us that we're coming up against a problem or an absence or a gap in reality itself, which is why Žižek used that example of the video game, right? Where you can't go into a certain building or can't go beyond a certain, I haven't played video games in a while, but I'm just thinking of like GoldenEye for Nintendo 64, where there's just certain buildings you can't go in.
I love that one.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. And the reason that for this gap, and actually I was checking the I'm trying to get better at checking the chat while we're doing this. Yeah. This guy, I don't know who this is, but the name is Daniel T, said that being is not self-identical and subjectivity is the gap. And I think that's a good way to put it. So what Harman, I think, is kind of guilty of, not necessarily here, but and he would contest this, that subject, we're used to thinking like subject there like equals human being, and that's something that Žižek is trying to push back against. And this is another sort of Hegelian point, and he's referencing this line in the Phenomenology of Spirit, the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, that it's a famous line that's not only as substance but also as subject. And so subject is not the name for this sort of human mastery that we see with like Descartes, where there's human, the I of the cogito, and then everything else on the other side of it. Subjectivity is the name that's given to to this incompleteness, or the gap that causes this incompleteness in reality. And so I know this is getting very abstract here, but I think those are just some of the points that he was making.
Yes, I do want to circle back to this thing about reality being incomplete, because it's easy to see what it means to say that our knowledge of reality is incomplete. It's a little bit harder, I think, to see what it means to say that reality is incomplete. So what I like about the video game metaphor is that it's really vivid, but then trying to unpack that a little bit and say, okay, but what exactly does that mean, right? So, like, just on a kind of simple-minded level, like, I could understand that if we were talking about something like Berkeley idealism, which we were talking about a little bit earlier, that you could, because you could literally have, like, God, being like the video game designer, leaving some things. Leaving some things vague, because they're whatever, the forest is just a few little points, you're never going to get to. But of course, that's not, despite his complicated reflections on, Christianity. Obviously, Žižek's an atheist, and so that's not it. And I can understand in a sort of simple way, maybe not simple when you start filling out the details, but that you could say that reality is incomplete in the sense that, okay, things have unrealized potentials, right? That's like a pretty clear sense in which reality could be incomplete. But first one's obviously wrong. The second one, I suspect, is at least not a full explanation of what he means by it. So do you think you could help us out here?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to see first if Conrad has anything to. I don't dominate it, but
yeah. Well, I just wanted to say, to me, what we're really seeing here is kind of the framing. Now that we've watched these two people speak, we can kind of see the framing of the debate. I think if we're looking at Harman, right, and I'm sure a lot of our audience has already deduced this based on what we said and what they've seen, but the principal problem, with his system is that it's like, where are objects from? Right, and he'll say, like, well, we shouldn't overmine or undermine objects. Like, we shouldn't, like, reduce objects to just their smallest constituent elements, or like obliterate them in favor of larger scale processes, right? But it's like, why? Right? Like, I mean, it's a sort of, it's an a priori sort of view. That ends up, being potentially quite difficult to justify, in spite of the way I think Harman quite cleverly, draws on phenomenological traditions to support what he's saying. It remains a problem, right? Whether we index it to phenomenology or whatever. For Žižek, I think the problem is, he goes this Hegelian route, which Russ was elucidating, in terms of, the sort of codependency of subject and substance, right? And he also puts sort of you could argue it's in Hegel. I mean, he certainly reads it through Lacan. This idea that negativity is always in the world. Okay, yeah. That's kind of an ontological reading of Lacan, and we can debate what the right way of reading Lacan is. But I feel like part of the problem with Žižek's kind of thought, like when he talks about science, right? Like, he's using this example of like quantum theory. Like, he'll just use like the observer effect to be like, well, like everything is shaped by the way we see it. There's a point we can't get behind. I mean, I feel like at that point, the only real hard thing you can say about the external world is like there's a negativity, which is inherent to it, and it's sort of mediated through our subjectivity. Right, which is also part of our subjectivity, because the subject also has a negativity, right?
Yeah. Okay, I do want to circle back to think about undermining and overmining, but finish up your thought first.
Sure. Well, and I just want to say that I think part of the difficulty, and I would think this is sort of what I also really like Adrian Johnston's work. Like, I'm not a Johnstonian or something, but I think it's really cool, and I think maybe this problematic animates it. But I think kind of for me, the problem with Žižek's work is that I feel like And we can situate it in Lacan or in Hegel or whatever. But I feel like the only real thing at this point, the only at the risk of vulgarizing, the only hard thing we can really say, is that there is this negativity, right, which is ontologized. And I think when he talks about identity, that's very interesting. I was like surprised when Žižek was talking about identity, like communism has an identity, because like you can say like, in Hegel, the structure of objects is kind of animating our inquiry, and when we get to chemistry as opposed to Aristotle or something, we have a more exacting understanding of nature. But I don't know if that ever, I don't see it as being an identity which has that sort of fixity, right? It's always a tentative,
Right,
provisional
yeah.
sort of identity.
Yeah. So, so what you said about overmining and undermining, which we got a little bit of it here. There's also an event that Žižek and Harman did in 2018, which is not exactly a debate like this one, but it's kind of an extended Harman presentation and some Žižek response. And I would recommend that people who who find this interesting and want more of it, check it out, because it's a pretty deep dive into a lot of Harman's views. Certainly, there's actually kind of a funny moment in it, especially from my perspective, in that one where neither of them is like hostile to it exactly, but Harman sort of lightly criticizes analytic philosophy, and Žižek, when he finally responds, sort of in a way sort of responds on its behalf, or Harman says that a sort of vice of analytic philosophy is thinking that you always have like a better picture of something, or you always have more knowledge of it if you're clearer, and sometimes that's not true. And he brings up historical knowledge and aesthetic things to sort of try to undermine this. And Žižek says something that's kind of funny actually in response to it, which is that there's a vice of continental philosophy, which is that people oftentimes make elaborate metaphors, which are interesting and aesthetically appealing, but they're sort of bluffing, and let's try to avoid that, right? So in that spirit, right? So I do want to get back also to and this is part of the reason we did this particular debate. I mean, I know lots of people who watch would find it interesting, but it's also selfishly a little bit for me, help me get a better better handle on some of this stuff. And so I think in that 2018 event, Harman does a pretty deep dive on undermining and overmining. So undermining when you're saying that like there's no whiskey glass, they're just quantum particles. They're like arranged, like some analytic metaphysicians will say that are arranged whiskey glass wise, right? But basically there's no glass. There's just the quantum particles. And overmining is sort of a neologism of Harman. He it has a different meaning, but in the way that he uses it is when you're trying to do the same thing from the opposite direction. That like think about the way that there might be some kind of like quasi mystical views or versions of idealism. Where there's just like being in general is like the real thing, and like the sort of more specific entities kind of drop out. And Harman wants to say that the real things that like Harman wants to like really insist that like what Quine calls mid-sized dry goods, tables, chairs, humans, dogs, cats, all that stuff really exist. That we shouldn't just undermine them or overmine them out of the picture. And I think Conrad's question about motivation is a good one, although I think it cuts in a lot of different directions, right? So because I think really the motivation, for wanting to say that the mid-sized dry goods really exist, we shouldn't undermine them or overmine them away, is just that sort of fits with our intuitions about what's real, and you can raise all kinds of skeptical questions about how seriously we should take those intuitions. I will just plug here really quickly. I wrote an article at the end of last month for Arc Digital Media about my graduate school mentor, Quentin Smith, who passed away, in the fall, who spent a lot of time on subjects like this, where I certainly didn't claim to have any kind of resolution, but the subject of like how seriously we should take intuitions and metaphysics and why is explored a little bit in there. But I think that it's also the idea that like the really that like the smallest things or the most whatever the sort of most basic things that you can sort of boil things down to, or the really real things, for example, is also kind of based on a metaphysical intuition. So it's not obvious to me that one of them is in a better epistemic boat, than the other one. And I think a really hard question here is if you're not just going to try to base these things on our intuitive sense of them, however sort of refined through logical arguments after that, what are you going to base it on, right? You could say science. Very unclear that science in itself is going to solve questions like this. It gets very tricky. So I do want to say that on behalf of Harman, although that's certainly not to say that the solutions are the right ones. But yeah, I do, and I do want to get back to the debate within a few minutes. But do you want to go back to the issue of what it sort of means, or what we're getting at, when we might say that reality itself is incomplete?
Yeah. So I think that this is actually, if you Harman earlier mentioned Žižek's book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, which I think people often ask what's the best way to, especially people who've been introduced to Žižek through either like his podcast appearances, like on Give Them an Argument, or like he was on Jacobin yesterday on weekends, or through just YouTube clips that they've seen from some of his Pervert's Guide films, where he's psychoanalyzing classics, scenes from classic films. But for his philosophy, there are a number of different entry points. The Sublime Object of Ideology, which is his first book in English from 1989, is a good one. And he says in the preface to that book that he basically, in some regards, he's been writing, he doesn't say this there, but in some regards, Žižek has been writing the same book over and over again. And I don't mean that he's just merely repeating himself, but trying to find different ways and different examples for articulating the main sort of ontological questions that he's interested in. And he says there at the outset that the goal of his project, and I think that this is just as true today as it was back 30 years ago, was to read or to reactualize Hegelian dialectics through Lacanian psychoanalysis. And so the question of like the incompleteness of reality, he gestures toward it very quickly, about like maybe 2 or 3 minutes from before where we paused, and he says reality versus the real, but doesn't really explain what he means there. So we talk about this a little bit in our introduction to the subject lessons collection, but Žižek, I think Harman's right. Žižek would not consider himself a realist, even though there are Lacanians, there is an argument for Lacanian realism. The term that Žižek would insist upon, and they talk about it soon, I think, in the debate, is materialism, which is another thing. Harman thinks that it's absurd for Žižek and those of us within that orbit to claim that our position is materialist, right? Especially from Hegel. Like, Hegel is supposed to be the arch idealist. How can you call him a materialist? But this is where I think Lacan comes in, because Lacan breaks up it's really kind of psychic experience into 3 registers: the imaginary, symbolic, and real. And for a long time, the imaginary and the symbolic are what most Lacanians focused on. And Žižek's real, one of his many contributions to not just Lacan, but philosophy, has been to focus on the symbolic and the real. And the simplest way to understand the real, I think, is as this sort of gap within the symbolic. This is why Žižek likes the film The Matrix. So the incompleteness there of reality, like to map this onto like Lacan onto the Matrix to try to make this less abstract. The symbolic order would essentially be the computer simulation that's that everyone is living in, what we experience as reality. And he's also critical of the Matrix, because then the Matrix posits that there is actually a real, like, beyond that, and that's that everyone's power is being harvested by the machines, and so that's actually reality. But for Lacan, the real is not something that, again, that's positivized, that exists, beyond the symbolic or beyond the program. The real is kind of glitches in the Matrix, where reality cannot be entirely encapsulated or symbolized by our experience. And so I think, I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but the real is like the incompleteness is this kind of excess, this gap within reality itself. So it's not so much chronological. Like Lacan is often taught as you have the imaginary, which is the mirror stage, and then you're ushered into the symbolic, and then it's not so much chronological. So it's not, and it's not teleological. It's not like reality is unfinished now, but eventually we will get there. It's the sense that there's always going to be this, it's never going to be finished. There's always going to be this gap. And for Žižek to sort of transpose that into his political philosophy, like that gap is human freedom. And that's where the possibility of coming up with a different political or a different socio-political order, a more sort of an order that's more radically emancipatory comes in. I know I'm still speaking kind of abstractly, but hopefully I kind of like glanced that or proposed some sort of an answer to that question or to address it.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I'm sure we could keep talking about this until we want to knock off for the night. So let's maybe circle back to it at a later point in the discussion. But unless Conrad wants to throw in anything more before we go back, let's return to the debate in just a moment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I do think that this poses certain difficulties for Žižek's position as a Marxist. I mean, I have no doubt, of course, that Žižek is a Marxist and promotes these sort of views. But I do think it's a little hard, just because I would differentiate here between what I would describe as, sort of strong Marxism and weak Marxism. And I don't mean that in the sense of, one is good and the other is bad. But in terms of how materialism is approached at the level of epistemology. So, I think Žižek's fundamental frame is sort of Hegelian Lacanian, right? He's kind of looking at, the emergence of the subject, right? Ontological incompleteness. And Marxism is kind of worked into that frame, right? As part of this, sort of dialectical process of working out and squared with these other ideas. But I think, in its strong form, the tendency would be not to foreground, thought or the subject to that degree, but to try to actually deduce subjectivity or thought from a certain, more a material base that has a certain kind of primacy, right? And there are more or less vulgar ways of doing that, right? Obviously with Lenin's sort of epistemology, we see this sort of, what's often called this reflection theory. There are other people who want to say that, there's a structural homology between transcendental philosophy like that of Kant and the structure of the value form, and historically, so more like economics at the level of form. But I just want to say that I do think that this potentially creates a problem for Žižek, because I don't see him as being able to locate this notion of the sort of base or infrastructure or thematize it in a way that would be characteristic of a stronger iteration of Marxism.
I think that's fair. I mean, Žižek does consider himself a Marxist, but Ben, I think you and I have talked about this before, like going back to, I think as early as like 93 in his Tearing with the Negative book, which is a great book, another early like classic, is he wants to retain, and actually he gestured toward that earlier when he's talking about that philosophy can be read as a history of people, of each philosopher sort of supplanting somebody whom he or she has misread. And he says, the greatest example of this for him is Marx misread Hegel. And I think that his project has been to do a return to Hegel, like from Marx, but then a sort of like retroactively like Marx infused Hegel. So I'm not disagreeing with you here. I agree with you. I think that as far as the sort of triad of his figures are concerned, like Marx is far in the background compared to Hegel and Lacan, even though again, like, he considers himself a Marxist.
Yeah. I mean, I also think, like, I don't know, like there are days when I think that, like, we might be better off, without the term Marxist, just to force everybody to spell out exactly what they mean, because Marx thinks a lot, like Marx says a lot of things, and and different people by calling themselves Marxists are emphasizing their agreement with different things, and it's not always, I mean, obviously we need abbreviations like that, but it does I think lead to a lot of talking past each other. So it's not hard to see a political sense in which it makes sense to say that that Žižek is a Marxist in some relatively conventional way, sort of, although also, and it's not hard to see the like lines of philosophical lineage, although there's also although they're sometimes taking him to places that are very unlike orthodox Marxism, for sure. But I like I actually did, before we go back to the debate, want to circle back to what you said about the Matrix, because I think that's interesting, and that's a nice vivid way of understanding maybe some of what's what's at stake here, because I think realism is thinking, okay, whether there's a matrix or not, right? That there is a thing that's the actual world that's outside of it. That there is such a thing as being disconnected from it. So if Žižek doesn't think that in a deep sense, that the Hegelianism goes to a point where he doesn't exactly think that, then that I think makes some of the differences clear. I will also say, just to really lower the tone of the discussion, just as movies, like I always thought that like where the Matrix movies really go wrong is in the second one, when Neo meets the architect, and the architect gives the speech that sounds sort of cool but doesn't really mean anything. It's just kind of babble.
I'm thinking, do you remember the Will Ferrell MTV Movie Awards, when he just kept saying he was the architect, and he just kept saying ergo vis-a-vis, and just like, yeah, I haven't seen that in like 15 years, but that just popped in my head when you were saying he gives this long speech that basically says nothing.
Yeah, and what he and I think the thing that like it would have made more sense, what they should have done, is just revealed that there was like a second level matrix, that none of the stuff that that you thought was going on from early in the first movie up until then, like that there was that's just another matrix.
Yeah.
But all right, let's watch a little more of the debate.
I will be Stalin tonight, and I will try.
And what are we? Who is Bukharin? Who is Trotsky? Who is?
Actually, if somebody were Trotsky, we would have to erase him, because in all of the images, as we know, he was in fact erased from history, from all the photographs. So there must be something there to talk about.
Can I make a brief remark?
Sure.
You will love it. Precisely with the case of Trotsky, I agree with you. You know what was Trotsky's mistake in the early and mid-20s? No. He was too much abstract in the bad sense, not in your sense, essentialist. He did not see how to gain power, You know, Stalin was very bright. You know, just in 23, he nominated over 100,000 of mid-level bureaucrats and so on. He knew that power, and Trotsky was extremely arrogant. Trotsky came to Politburo session to boast with Flaubert in French. He was really like, I don't care. And then all of a sudden, in late 20s, Trotsky discovered he's like that cat above the precipice, you know. He looked down, there is nothing. He fell down. So this I deeply appreciate in contrast to what you think. I think that with regard to what I think subject, which is precisely an inhuman abstract subject, I cannot find anything that would more fit to my notion of subject than what, for example, somebody like, although I know your differences with her, Jane Bennett describes as this, a transhuman assemblage and so on. I have no problem with totally asserting that. I have no problem. I'm not humanist.
Can you just, what is assemblage? Can you speak to this?
Assemblage.
Maybe some of it's...
Yes, this is the theory that things are built together out of many components to form one thing.
Which are relatively independent.
Yes,
no?
that's right.
Like, as we already talked before, Trump is an assemblage. It's crucial to understand him that in the sense that he built his relative hegemony through assembling elements which have relative independence, a certain working class populism, a certain this, a certain that, and so on. And it's inconsistent, obviously. But beware, this inconsistency is his strength.
Before we get into Trump, can I answer some of the points from your, because there were so many interesting things there. I was going to maybe address three if I can. The first one, I'll respond to the one about the essence of communism. First of all, there's a question as to whether there is such a thing as an essence of communism, or whether we're talking about different phases.
I'm good, essentially. You're no historicist, relativist.
No, not at all, not at all. Remember, in the book of Materialism about the Dutch East India Company, I at least considered the possibility that there wasn't just one company, that it went through several different companies under the same name. I determined that, in fact, there was just one company, it was one thing.
I obviously agree with you.
Against
in the
Leibniz.
same sense, I think there is one communism.
Okay, all right.
It's too cheap to say Stalin falsified it or whatever.
Yes, that's right. Also, essences for me don't necessarily have to stay the same over time. They can develop.
Absolutely develop with you.
So
I agree with you.
It's not bad essentialism that there's one platonic form that everything copies forever. I also talk about symbioses in my book, which are kind of in between detailed changes and developmental changes. So I think you'd have to look empirically at an individual case like communism. So you'd have to be a historian working from a triple.
No, but would you nonetheless agree? My central point was exactly in your sense. Communism, precisely as a universal movement notion, has an in itself.
Yes.
It's legitimate to ask where it was impenetrable to itself, what potentials it didn't actualize.
It's not a meaningless question. Some people treat it as if it were, and it's not. To ask, what could it have been? What is it really about? And of course, every object has multiple objects that make it up. So communism has parts too, just like any other object.
Sorry to interrupt you, but here again, I deeply agree with you. I would link this to that, your wonderful notion of proximate failure.
Yes.
Okay, you wanted to say something.
No, I want to talk about that. Proximate failure. I have the idea in the book of Materialism that one of the ways you recognize real objects is by looking for failures, not successes.
Absolutely.
Because if something succeeds too easily, it's probably just part of the environment. It's probably just fitting in. But something fails, you know that it's a bit out of sync with the environment. And so I talked about that in a few cases of the Dutch East India Company. In the book I just finished the other day for Penguin, an introduction to O, for Pelican actually, I used the US Civil War as an example. And when I'm talking about Grant and Lee as the two great generals of that war, I was looking at their failures, of which there were many prior to their successes, which I think was a proof of their greatness. The fact that they had these failures.
Do you buy the theory which always intrigued me? I'm sorry, but it's such a nice conversation. No? Do you buy the theory that at Gettysburg, it could have turned otherwise?
Yes.
Just Grant forgot to put artillery on some hill there.
It was Meade. Grant wasn't in the east yet. Grant was still out west. But yeah, Meade could have put the artillery.
That's the key. It could have turned...
the South could have won if Pickett's charge had succeeded, and Meade could have also chased down Lee and destroyed his army and ended the war. So there were several things that could have gone differently. It was a very contingent battle. However, I think the other battles, two of them are more important in particular, but that's another issue. Well, a civil war.
No, but you know what I wanted to ask you? Sorry. Yes. No, a very precise question concerning this. I think what interests me especially are not only this approximate failure in the sense of alternate history, and I'm also like you addicted to them, you know, all the bullshit that we get now, Men in the High Castle, SS, Great Britain, I'm an avid viewer of that. But isn't it also the other way around that often we get false opening in
Yes.
the sense of we think that something is possible and it was just an accident that it didn't happen, but it was a deeper necessity. For example, here I remain an old-fashioned half-Marxist, opposed to what my good friend, very dignified person, the Catholic Derridean John Caputo, he claimed, why be against capitalism if you imagine a capitalism which, like Sweden in the 60s, does welfare, this, that, and so on, that all this would be possible. Well, I doubt if this is possible. I think one of the tricks of politics is that something that appears as mere contingent failure, oh my God, we could have done that, but we didn't. A deeper analysis of what you would call in itself can also discover not only that there was an option to do something else, but that what appeared to us as an opening really was none, that it couldn't have happened. So here we should do a complex analysis. You agree, no?
We should. And in the Dutch East India Company case, it was the geographical points that were inevitable. There were two straits in Indonesia that had to be captured by somebody. So that's one
But
example.
can I ask you a Lacanian deep psychoanalytic,
Sounds great.
psychologizing question?
Yeah.
Because I love that book. I even told him before that, you know, in my communist universe where you don't have free reading, these official gray brochures are distributed to you, printed like Mao's Red Book in 10 million copies. In my communist empire, your immaterialism would be like distributed from elementary and people would be sent to Gulag if they forgot to read your book. No, but what I want to ask is, like, what attracted you to that stupid East Dutch company? What was the particular cause of desire?
The particular cause is that Leibniz makes fun of it and says that it's a pseudo-object because it's just a bunch of different parts together, right? He says that in the letters to Arnaud. So I wanted to say, no, the Dutch East India Company is an object. And this is one thing I don't like about the whole Aristotelian tradition is that they use nature as the criterion of reality. If something's natural or simple, then it's going to be real. Whereas we need to be able to talk about airplanes and universities and societies as objects.
And non-existing things.
Yeah.
But at least in a way, I think, don't you think that not only is there approximate failure, but something that did not happen but could have happened can, as such as failure, exert a terrifying influence. So I would go even further here than you. Like the whole generation could be ruined by something that they should have done, but they didn't do it.
Sure. Yeah, there can be failed historical tasks, I think.
Yeah, and they can ruin your life for decades and so on.
Biographically too, right? Individuals can ruin their
so
lives.
again, here, you know, my problem with your immaterialism is that, to be very brutal and cynical, what you call immaterialism, I'm almost tempted to call materialism, you know. I'm not that primitive materialist who thinks to be materialism, it must be something that you grasp and so on. What I call it's just, it has to be in some sense contingent, open, that's enough for me. Materialism has nothing to do with matter for me.
Right, but remember, I quoted Levi Bryant asking them, why do you call it materialism? He was asking that about you in particular. What's the point of calling it materialism if it involves nothing material?
Because again, for example, again, look at quantum physics. It's in a way matter without matter there. Waves, are they material, in what sense, and so on. And why is it materialism? Because it's a certain contingency, openness, and so on. It's a certain purely formal structure, non-teleological, whatever, contingent, that defines materialism for me.
All right.
It doesn't have to be some hard... Would you agree with this beautiful idea that came to me that paradoxically, in 19th century still, materialism meant brutal, tasteless reality. But today, and that's why I have here, you will kill me, you will hire a guy to break my fingers, some mafia friend, because that's my problem with Tarkovsky, the director. He's so spiritual, but at the same time, a brutal materialist. You know, for him, Tarkovsky, spiritual experiences when you even put your head into mud and so on and so on. So today, and it all began with Heideggerian finitude, is that idealists emphasize our limitation to body and so on, while materialists today have this freedom to move in total immaterial abstraction. But okay, let's get away. Strike back. Go
All
on.
right, materialism. the point for me is that matter, of course, means the unshaped material, the mother etymologically, and I don't think there is such a thing.
I agree totally.
Okay, right, there are forms. So what would be the value of using materialism? I think usually the value is that it has a kind of leftist political cachet, that it has to do with the Enlightenment and it has to do with critically tearing things down to the ultimate.
Correct you, and you will agree with me.
Okay,
Even here, and you will agree with it.
Right.
Things are more complex. For example, my other beloved, you see the depth of my Stalinist taste, Robespierre. He opposed materialism. You know why? Because for him, it didn't have this leftist connotation. For him, and he was right, I claim, materialism was a brutal ideology of aristocracy in decay. So even this, you are too close, you buy too quickly this idea that materialism is always necessarily associated with the left. It's not necessary.
No, it just has often been, you have to admit. And,
I do, yeah.
Okay, and there are two kinds of materialism. The traditional kind is you're reducing a thing to the ultimate matter of which it's made, and it generally was particles moving through a void. There's other variants of that. But when people talk about materialism today, they're talking about the other reduction, the upward reduction, that everything is contingent, socially constructed, that it involves our practices rather than ideas. And I don't really see the point of either of those because they both distract from the object just in between those two extremes. Right?
I have no problem with that.
Just a
Here
vocabulary
I have no
difference.
problem.
Okay.
When I take power, you will go, if you will go to Gulag, it will not be for this claim.
All right, I wanted to say something about Heidegger also.
Perfect.
And then something about quantum theory, maybe.
Yeah.
It was very interesting that you were making a criticism based on Heidegger, because I always wonder about you, how Heidegger fits into your narrative of the history of philosophy. Because you are in many ways a Hegelian, and many Hegelians will say that Heidegger is just a neo-Kantian relapse into transcendental philosophy.
It's much more complex.
Yes,
Heidegger
good.
is and no matter how we hate him politically,
Yes.
Unfortunately, he is the real thing. He is one of the great philosophers. But sorry.
So what do you get in him that you don't get out of Hegel?
Sorry?
What do you get from Heidegger that you don't get from Hegel, since you find so much in Hegel compared to many people?
Well, I'm here pretty much open. Do you get everything from Hegel? Hegel has certain limits. I'm very open here. For me, you know what interests me so much in Heidegger, and you should be interested in it. The proof that he is the ultimate, for me, transcendental philosopher, not in the Kantian sense, but in the sense that we are condemned, constrained to a certain historical horizon meaning of being. And all we can do is hope for or await, lay the foundation for another. And he, you know that in some of his works, from early ones in late 20s to his last seminar of Heraclitus, he simply admits, he says, okay, we have material objects. It's clear that the horizon of being, the way the meaning of reality is open to us, doesn't create these objects. So, and then he asked this naive question, so how do objects exist outside the horizon of being, which is our way to apprehend them? And he admits it's a totally open question. He doesn't have anything to say about it.
Yes, and that's the problem that he and Husserl shared, is they both considered the reality as a kind of pseudo question, right? Because we're already, it's already outside of ourselves.
Heidegger admitted it at the
Yes,
end,
he did.
that the question persists.
Right. Now, you asked what I'm getting out of Heidegger. Now, I admit that he's a transcendental philosopher, and he, in terms of his self-conception, I think he sees himself that way, especially in Sein und Zeit. But what I think happens is something in the tool analysis that he doesn't quite realize that takes us in another place. You've got the tool analysis. Everything's working flawlessly, and then something breaks. And so you notice for the first time the floor that I was relying on had
Here you have
collapsed.
again your stupid proximate failure.
Yes,
no?
that's right.
Sorry.
That's right. Now, the usual reading of this is that praxis comes before theory. First, we were using it practically, and therefore it's connected to all these other things, and now it's theoretical because it broke. The problem is that theory and praxis aren't different enough, as I see it. Both theory and praxis are translating the object into their own terms. One is conscious, one is not conscious, but it doesn't really make a big difference, I don't think. And too many Heidegger scholars have read that as being the key difference. Praxis comes before theory. I think what's actually happening is...
That's why, do you also oppose, although he's a nice guy, Dreyfus' being in the world?
I do.
Is this the ultimate, almost pseudo-Marxist practice interpretation of Heidegger?
Yes, he says that the background is something like a sociological understanding. So the Japanese babies are raised differently from American babies. I don't. That doesn't go far enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What's going on there is that there's something deeper than theory and praxis, and I think Heidegger could have been talked into that. What he probably wouldn't have agreed with, of course, is the idea that I have that there's something deeper, even in inanimate causation, because he had no way to think about that at all. Two things smashing into each other where Dasein was not there at all. Heidegger has nothing really to tell us about that. He's enough of a Kantian that he's talking about.
What he would say, I agree with you, is that okay, two things, of course, can crash out there, but the only way for us to make sense of it is to read it within our hermeneutic horizon and so on and so on.
But I don't think that's true.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I think, Graham, you bring up the story of two stars or two asteroids colliding near a distant star, and there is an astronomer who captures the image in a photograph. How do you describe these different, you would call them objects, different relations? And can we insert another kind of participant, let's say? So here, to kind of bring a fourth, maybe a fourth in, and this is where I would like to maybe transition us back a little bit to Earth, to say that there's not only an astronomer with a camera out there in space, but also, let's say, the eye of somebody, an eye of a subject, an eye of somebody, let's say, like Trump. Trump is watching. Let's say Trump, the French would say l'œil, Trump l'œil, out there, and producing a kind of another kind of narrative, let's say, about this event, an alternative, perhaps, reality. How would you begin to describe now this quadruple looking at each other?
I'm trying to avoid the temptation to unload on Trump right now.
But Trump would have probably read it as, something sexual, two bodies hitting each other.
I think in a way, well, it comes back to a couple of concerns that were already brought up. One concern is there such a thing as a subject without, let's say, an object?
No,
or is there such a thing as a subject who is a kind of, what did you call it? A kind of collage, not collage, but assemblage of things, and how do we produce a sense of reality? What does it mean to
Interesting, and for me, reality is a more important word than truth, because truth to me implies that somebody thinks they can get it. It's not just out there, but they can get it. Whereas reality for me means that you're doing something, and then there's the proximate failure that's alerting you to something that you're doing wrong. And I think that's why I wasn't so happy with the narrative about post-truth politics, because who really had the political truth to begin with? But I think we're in a phase of post-reality politics. And Berta Latour wrote an interesting article about Trump that you can read in the Los Angeles Review of Books online for free, where he made an interesting case. He said Trump is not a fascist, because at least as Latour reads fascism, it's a kind of fake attempt to bring back the Greek and Roman polis combined with technology. You agree? Oh, good. And he said what Trump really is an escapist, because what are really the political issues? Climate change, refugees, and he's simply pretending they don't exist. And so it's a denial of reality more than an attempt to say an untruth. He's not making contact with political realities that we need to be dealing with right now. So that's probably a better way to, I think I'm persuaded.
Perhaps that's the mode of operation, but then there is a kind of audience on the other side who might not be able to distinguish between, let's say, the photograph and the fiction.
But back to Trump, sorry. I agree with this description, and I also agree that Trump is not a fascist. You know why? Because would you agree with this? The majority of leftists are, I agree, I'm here very critical of most of them, are often lazy, which means when there is something new emerging and they see it's bad, but they are too lazy to really think what is happening, the easiest thing is to apply a non-term. Oh, it's neo-fascism, fascism, and so on. It's not. Even I claim, look, we have to analyze all this. Like they claim, oh, Trump dismissing immigrants or European new right is the same as Nazi anti-Semitism. No, it's not. Moshe Postone, the Chicago Marxist, otherwise I don't often agree with him, pointed out nicely the difference. For the Nazis, Jews were not simply out there invading us. Jews were already here in Germany, the secret masters pulling the strings. While nobody claims immigrants invading, I don't like this term, I sympathize with them, Europe are secret masters and so on. It's a totally different logic. So again, here I read your point about failures and so on. What I'm afraid of is, again, escapism can be very effective politically, even if Trump is an escapist. It can work for a couple of years.
Couple of years?
Even more, yes. So my point is, don't try to avoid what I call, although I love him, I often watch him, Jon Stewart syndrome, or we are so much wiser, we make fun of Trump and so on and so on. Well, we make fun of him, but he may have the last laughter, at least for a couple of years.
Maybe a question is then, if he's
Who, Trump?
If Trump is so good at making reality unfamiliar to us, and I'm here now coming back to some of the terms that maybe come up in conversation, there is a kind of defamiliarization, and this is something that Graham, we've talked a little bit about Shklovsky's term "astranение." If this is already
Usually they translate it, sorry, extraneation, I think.
extraneation,
No,
as
the
opposed to
reason is to
defamiliarization.
avoid
Yeah.
alienation.
Right, but estrangement might work.
Estrangement. Let's say
yes.
estrangement. If this is, let's say, happening at the level of a kind of political message, isn't life today appearing more like art? If that is a technique of art and all of a sudden it is in life, what are we to do with this?
I've always been really moved by a remark by the novelist J.G. Ballard, who said that the role of the artist has reversed in our time. He said in the past, the artist produced fictions.
Yeah.
Now we're surrounded by fictions. The artist has to produce the reality. And so I think it's easy for Trump's people to produce all these alternative narratives, alternative facts. But ultimately, you have to have a politics that's believable because it's grounded in some reality.
All right, so I think we're maybe entering into to a different enough subject that it might be a natural time to talk about a little bit of what we watched in the last chunk, starting with I think the part about communism, and then maybe get into some of the questions that were being raised in the chat about how all this might relate to different versions of materialism or physicalism, and how this is this might have to do with some of what's I mean, obviously I know that they there were like 200 subjects that were just addressed, but just to pick a couple of them out, right? That that might be telling as far as like larger themes of the debate. So the communism thing was interesting, and it goes back in a way to what we were talking about earlier about cultural essentialism in a very different way. So there's this kind of there's a way, what Žižek is referring to, and of course this has nothing to do with any sort of sympathy for for Stalinism. I mean, Žižek was himself a democratic dissident in Yugoslavia, before the fall of that system. But among people who are socialists or communists of some kind, and who and who do have democratic objections to that system. That that sort of capital C communism that existed in I mean, I'm flattening a lot of distinctions here. What existed in Yugoslavia is very different from what existed in the Soviet Union, but whatever, that like at all variations of that. That there's this sort of debate that Žižek was referring to about the extent to which we should just say, hey, look, this has nothing to do with us. We're talking, when we talk about socialism, we mean a radically democratic alternative to capitalism, and this was clearly not that. So, what are you talking about? And it's very easy to certainly find places where, like, Marx describes, not that it's a subject he spent a lot of time on, but Marx describes what he sort of has in mind for communism. Talks about free associations of producers, or praises aspects of the Paris Commune he thought were, sort of presaged, what could exist after capitalism, and to contrast that to the Soviet Union and say, all right, these are just very different things. This is a bad system that's sort of trying to cover itself in the in the glory of Marxist socialism, but we shouldn't have anything to do with that. But then I think there are other maybe more complicated attempts to navigate that start with the same kind of anti-Stalinist starting point, but don't just say this is something that has nothing to do with us. And I think so I'd point, so for example, my friend Bhaskar Sankara in his book The Socialist Manifesto he doesn't do a deep dive on it, but there's like a passage where he does sort of say, look, maybe that certain kinds of narratives about historical progress and classical Marxism did contribute, did at least set the tone for some of the things we find objectionable that happen in the system. and he's obviously still saying that as a convinced Marxist. Or like, I think this actually comes very close to what Žižek seemed to be saying. There's a great line by the early 20th century revolutionary Victor Serge, who moved to early Soviet Russia, from France, and was very active and at a high level in the early Communist International, and was around the Bolshevik leadership in the early Russian Revolution, and then he was part of the left opposition with Trotsky, and he was sent to Siberia and ultimately exile. And he has this response to people who say, "Look, you want to defend like the legacy of the Russian Revolution, but look what it became." And can't you see that the germs of Stalinism were already there from the beginning? And Serge says, yeah, the germs of Stalinism were there. There are just lots of other germs there too.
Yeah, can I maybe? Okay, yeah, sure. What I like about Žižek in terms of his approach, because you're raising this question, Ben, about sort of how we should view Marxist history and define it, whether we should, to what degree we should sort of disown things that are widely perceived as having been, certainly in the West, as having been failed, or having led to certain persecutions. And I think, I think Ben, you're probably somewhat familiar with my own stance on this, which is sort of criticism, but a refusal to disown. And I think I'm probably influenced by Žižek in that. But one thing I really like about the way Žižek approaches the subject, certainly he understands, I think the need to go beyond these models and their inadequacy, both sort of morally as well as economically versus what we would like to establish. But I do think where he's really good, there's a certain kind of fatalism that and actually there was a recent piece Žižek wrote about Robert Brandam's book about Hegel, A Spirit of Trust, and Žižek really foregrounds some of the pessimistic aspects of Hegel. But I think if Žižek is sometimes, if there's a certain kind of often kind of perverse sympathy he seems to have for these sort of communist figures who are sometimes described as sort of totalitarian. I think actually at a lecture in Slovenia, the one Russ was at, Žižek said that Stalin and Deng were the two successful Marxists of the 20th century, implying, of course, we should do better. I think one thing that there's this Hegelian kind of fatalism, because what Hegel really understands is the way that all of these things, we have these ideals, but then they're transposed into the world, right? And that, like, when they're transposed into the world, the only means often through which they're able to survive is through making a sort of succession of concessions, right? I mean, isn't it ironic in a way that if we look at sort of liberal republicanism or the kind of model of the EU that's being pursued today, that in a sense, the precondition of it, is Napoleon going around and kind of smashing, feudal lords in Germany and all this. I mean, this guy wasn't a Democrat, right? He was kind of like the military dictator of France, right? Albeit a Republican constitutionalist and so on. So, I mean, I think one has to understand that when Žižek says, well, we have to establish something that's more democratic and so on and so forth. I mean, I think there's a certain humility about it, right? Because that is, very much his goal. But I think what he's also very sensitive to is how quickly these things kind of become messed up and perverted, the moment they're sort of introduced into the field of reality. I mean, let's take the United States, right? Imagine we have this, communist, leftist revolution in the United States, we take the White House, whatever, and then, then it's like, well, how do we go about this? It's well known America is sort of neo-colonial in its policy towards a lot of nations, controlling, manufacturing capital in Africa, its companies, sort of sucking rents from other countries. I mean, it's like if you go in on day one and you're like, let's just jettison all foreign rents, right? Your revolution's probably not going to last for like 10 minutes. Right. So then you're in a situation where you're like, oh, wait, so now we have to be structurally racist. Right. If insofar as racism is a structure, which I believe it is, in order to keep this thing going. Right. And those are, I think, the kind of choices you're just facing every day. So, again, I think there's a dialectical pessimism that pervades Žižek's thought, which gives it a certain maturity and fullness, rather than just citing a couple of passages from Marx's work and saying, well, communism didn't become this ideal thing. that Marx maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly not helpful to. I mean, like Alec Nove makes this point in his book, The Economics of Feasible Socialism, that it's like the least helpful way to contrast it, to criticize those regimes is by contrasting it to something that we're not even sure could exist. Because and like, yeah, you like it's. Right. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious why that's not really the most interesting way to criticize it. I think you need to try to show that it's different from something that could have existed. Which I think, I mean, they were going back and forth between the stuff about communism, the East India Company, and the Civil War. But I took to be like what was at least being hinted at with that with the stuff about the Battle of Gettysburg. But what were you going to say, Russell?
Oh, I mean, I was just going to say that. Well, one point, I like that Conrad mentioned Žižek's modesty here, because he very clearly says this in a number of well, not just interviews, but also pieces that, he's specifically using the signifier communism to differentiate. And, I don't have any problem with socialism, and I know that in some regards Žižek doesn't either. But that as a sort of provocation, and it means specific things to him. Like it means most specifically the commons, which is exactly what we don't have a sense of anymore, because everything is there's the threat for everything to be privatized or privatized, but. I was thinking of the one thing that I wanted to say, or I wanted to talk about the problem of, or the question of materialism, like why use the signifier of materialism? And I think that actually thinking about Žižek's use of the term communism and the concept of communism and where that comes in, because Harman has said this elsewhere, that basically, I think one of the places that he says it is in a book, I think it's called The Rise of Realism, and it's a sort of conversation that he has with somebody I mentioned earlier, Manuel Delanda, about what constitutes materialism, what constitutes realism. So he's made this sort of charge, I would call it, a number of times, that the reason why Žižek likes the term materialism is because of this leftist cachet that it has. And I see why there are people who are considered themselves in this same sort of Hegelian, Lacanian framework that wouldn't use the term materialism, or wouldn't be comfortable with it, or would prefer to just say dialectics. And I think that to take Harman's point seriously, if you go back from starting with Marx and Engels up through Lenin, maybe even Trotsky to a certain degree, up through Mao, one of the defining characteristics of materialism is contradiction. And I think that this is what I think that in certain ways, what Žižek said, I was taking that by materialism, he means a sort of like contingency or openness, like matter without matter. And there's debates among people like, Žižek and Adrian Johnston, who's been mentioned earlier, is like Adrian's argument is that his sort of imminent critique of Žižek is that quantum physics doesn't do the work that he thinks it does. Biology is better, is the better science to turn to, and neurobiology, right? Johnston has that book with Malibu, right? Self and Emotional Life. Is that I'm forgetting? Is that the title of it?
Yeah, that's their debate about psychoanalysis.
Yeah. But the idea, I think, that materialism is doing the work here of contradiction, which he gets. That's the one thing that I think he thinks, not the one thing, but the main thing that Marx gets from Hegel that is correct, and where I think that he disagrees here, where he thinks Marx goes wrong, is the thinking that contradiction can be sort of entirely or ultimately overcome. So, I just wanted to say that you can debate as to whether or not materialism the proper signifier for this. But I do think that that's kind of what Žižek understands by materialism is contradiction, and that contradiction is embodied within the figure of the subject. Subject is what sort of gives body to this negativity or this antagonism or contradiction, and so you could call that something else, but that's the signifier that Žižek is attaching to it. And I don't think that it's that necessarily there's a split between the political use of the term and the philosophical use of the term, because if you go back to the mostly communist politicians / philosophers, I mean, like, Lenin is a perfect example, this Mao is a perfect example, that in their political theory, materialism is understood as contradiction.
All right, let's I want to be sensitive to people's time constraints here, so let's see if we can. I do want to loop back to the stuff about physicalism and materialism, but I want to make sure we at least get through up until the Q&A starts, because that'll be the natural stopping point, and then we can kind of digest it and talk about it for a few minutes. But then if people have to go after that, that works.
So what is then the representation of reality? Because if reality has a certain modality, let's say, certain kinds of formats, and let's say we're meant to produce now reality instead of fiction, what are the techniques for doing that?
Yeah, that's.
I graciously allow you to answer this one.
One of them is looking for places where things are failing.
Absolutely right. I would have followed the antagonism. Ideology is for me to obfuscate the antagonism.
Yes.
To project it onto an external enemy and so on and so on. Yes. Sorry, go on.
No, that's my best answer.
No, where we should agree again is, I hope we do that. Although, as you would have put it, I agree with you here, there is no direct access to reality.
Yes.
So we shouldn't play simply the game, that's ideology, we have a direct access. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, not everything is simply ideology.
That's right.
It matters how much you register the very inconsistencies, cracks, failures, and so on and so on.
Do you think I was fair in worrying that you are identifying ideology with realism? Is it more complicated than that? When I made the remarks.
What do you mean by realism here?
Well, it seems in Sublime Object of Ideology like you're ascribing to the anti-Semite a realist metaphysical position. That the problem is they're saying there really is Jews out there that have an essence, and that's where anti-Semitism comes from. And what makes me worry about that is it makes it seem like you're blaming realism for being a form of ideology.
I see. Okay, I would have to go more in detail, but okay. I share your fear here. You know where?
I have a follow-up. I have a follow-up after.
Okay,
I'm sorry. You know where I share your fear, but I would complicate things. Okay. What I mean by criticizing realism is this, and that's where comes what I mentioned there, this secret essence of the Jew. Look, Ernesto Laclau, my otherwise good friend for some time at least, claimed that an anti-Semitic subject always gets caught in a paradoxical tension. You cling to anti-Semitism, Jews are evil, and so on and so on. But then you happen to live close to a neighbor who is a kind old Jew, and then you cannot bring the two together. Your ideological thesis, Jews are evil, and the kind old Jewish gentleman who is there. I told once Ernesto, wait a minute, look at me, old European fascist. Don't you know what is anti-Semitism? It's easy to bring them together. A true anti-Semite would instantly answer, you see, that's why Jews are dangerous. They are really evil, but they mask this through their kind appearance, you know. That's the magic of anti-Semitism is that all the facts are reinterpreted as showing the opposite. But I want to say, sorry, very briefly.
That's a great point.
Another thing about this ostranenie, rendering strange. I think, nonetheless, we should not confuse two things. One is ostranenie, and here I see the danger of Trump. It's more that ostranenie, this estrangement, in the sense that things that were unthinkable 10 years ago, to be openly racist, to advocate torture and so on, are now all of a sudden acceptable. They no longer even surprise us. That's the tragic sign of regression for me. Trump is for me not only economic, political, but even not even moral, a catastrophe at the level of public decency.
So do you regret having seemed to have supported him over Hillary
No,
Clinton?
no,
You don't?
absolutely.
Why not?
Because I will tell you why.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
my very simple party line. I think that we should never forget, and I may be wrong, I'm not dogmatically clinging to it, that Trump's success is a symptom, not in any deep psychoanalytic sense, the result of the failure of the liberal center and left. And if we don't address that problem, of this leftist hegemony which is failing not only in the United States, but also in Europe and so on, we will not get rid of Trump. So the crucial task for me is to change something in this left liberal field, to move it maybe a little bit more to, should it even call it left? I have the same doubts as you about left, right, and so on. Otherwise, Trump will just return. That's not the key point. So my crazy hope was that it's maybe worth to take the risk, Trump, to mobilize, to bring something like more Bernie Sanders, whatever, and so on and so on. This is why the truly dangerous person today for me, for example, is Nancy Pelosi. Because she is precisely renormalizing the situation. She made recently an interview where she said, don't worry, we had Reagan for 8 years, we had Bush, we will have Trump, things go normal and so on. No, Trump is really a catastrophe.
Slavoj, can I pick up the term symptom that you brought up?
Yeah.
Because I think, this is from the sublime object of ideology. So we come back a few years, a couple of decades back. If the symptom is something that we can kind of borrow from psychoanalysis, but originally you trace it quite beautifully back to Marx.
Lacan says this.
Lacan says
symptom,
Marx kind of brings up the idea of symptom as the kind of excess of ideology. So would it be possible to bring this into architecture in the following way, that let's say buildings are a sort of symptom of ideology, that they are exactly at the intersection of capitalist desire, and also they produce a kind of let's say a problem, but also in visualization of authorship. How do we see these? How do we understand buildings as symptoms of both capitalism and authorship, as a kind of,
if I may
dichotomy
add
between
a brief improvisation to provoke you, then you should take over. Can I just add something to that Ostranenie estrangement stuff? That would be this simple ideological regression. But I think we should not confuse this, like what in the way Trump estranged us from old liberal certainty, with another, like here. It may surprise you, but although I know you don't agree with her. For example, the way Jane Bennett describes that famous trash site with all the interacting, that's for me the true productive estrangement, something that you consider simply an affair of human desires when you posit humans as interacting with biological processes, organic, inorganic. You get a certain inhuman view of the situation. And that fascinates me absolutely. So it's more complex. But to go back to symptom, I prefer not to use this term too much, because in psychoanalysis it has a very precise meaning. It's especially, symptom is never just a symptom. Lacan plays with this term symptom like a knot. Symptom is really what holds the subject together. If you dissolve the symptom, it's not you get the truth. Usually you get a psychotic breakdown and so on. Symptom is precisely not just a symptom in the sense of a sign of some real thing going on. For example, to refer
can you relate it to
what
can
you
you relate
said.
it to authorship? I mean, can you relate it to authorship? Let's say all buildings by Frank Gehry are symptoms of his author function.
Why I would prefer even not to use the term symptom. You know, if we go to, and my God, I talk too much, you should counterattack. You know what fascinates me in architecture? It was already quoted today. In what sense, at least a certain, maybe I'm universalizing it too much, modern architecture, all these great projects, Corbusier and so on, it's clear that they not only react to certain social problems, antagonisms, but they propose, for example, the new urban design and so on, separating place to sleep, place to work, place to have fun, as a solution to these problems. And second, this is why my arch enemy, if you ask me, and here Frank Gehry is not totally innocent, are, I think, one thing to bomb today are these public performative venues. You know, the idea is operas, concert halls shouldn't be just elitist operas. You should have their amusement parks, cafeterias, open public space. It's pure absolute lie. These are open spaces which are themselves isolated under the cupola and so on. But another thing, so in this sense, you cannot understand architecture, and I'm not saying the ultimate truth about architecture here. You can argue in a more formalist way, but what fascinated me, another thing about, for example, this is my true love, I must admit it, the classical Stalinist architecture, wedding cake and so on. You know what fascinated me there so much? Something that in ideology you were absolutely prohibited to say, that Soviet Union claimed to be an egalitarian worker state. It was in reality an extremely almost neo-feudal hierarchic state. You just look at the buildings and you see it. And this is the beautiful paradox. It's not as a kind of a dissident act. You had to do it like this. It was like if you wanted to undermine Stalinism, you needn't to go, you just looked at the building. Stalinist official building, and you see the lie of official ideology. It confirms this idea to me, deep Freudian idea that you cannot totally lie. Truth is somehow always articulated.
What do we say about the same exact place, maybe only 15 years earlier, having a kind of formalist moment of abstraction, and then somehow killing it. And I think this is something that we can relate a little bit to today.
I know what you mean.
I think we can relate it to today, because if Hutemas closes in the 20s, if Bauhaus closes in the 30s, if we're now entering a difficult time period, we're not quite sure where we are chronologically. The question, on the one hand, is what are we to do? We're here in a liberal,
architectural question or a general?
I think it's an institutional question of knowledge. So let's say it's an architecture question on the one hand, but it can be broader than that. What are we to do as those who produce knowledge? Have we entered the 21st century? Are we repeating the 20th? Here at SCIARC, I guess, well,
I think we are, but my God, I talk too much.
But
you want to do it.
Graham, I'm curious to hear from you, because
you is both of us.
I'm curious to hear from Graham first.
Yes.
Can I answer first the question about buildings as symptoms of capitalism or neoliberalism?
Because this is a flat, abstract statement.
Exactly.
I don't think you learn a lot.
You don't. And what I'm worried about is that usually that statement is a way of gaining the moral high ground in a debate.
Yes,
so then you can talk down to everyone. And so O says all objects are equal, and Alexander Galloway writes an article saying we think humans are garbage because we're the equal of garbage. I mean, come on. There's no intellectual content in that claim. He's simply trying to look down on us from above. And this is what I worry about.
That's the problem, sorry, with political correctness.
Yes, that's right.
For me. The more white people who act politically correct, the more they apparently humiliate themselves. The more they gain in this pleasure of, but by humiliating ourselves, by assuming guilt for everything, we assume the high moral ground and so on.
Slava, I'm cutting you off for 1 minute. Graham.
1 minute.
5 minutes.
No, 1 minute's fine.
Let's make a deal, 3.5.
So yes, there's obviously a sense in which buildings can be read as symptoms of whatever period they're in, but I'm not sure that's the right move to make right now. I think we need a formalist move at the moment, as unfashionable as it is. We need to look at the building as cut off from its surroundings, just like we need to do with the artwork, but without the drawback of the earlier formalism, which is that it tried to exclude anything outside the work itself. That isn't always the case. Sometimes the work does let other influences permeate. And so in art criticism, for example, you had Clement Greenberg's formalism, which I have some sympathies with, but he ends up too much against performance art, conceptual arts, installations, these things. But you can have those things and still have it be an autonomous formal unit. So you can have performers.
What do you mean exactly by formalism?
I suppose the way you could define formalism is that a thing is autonomous from its surroundings. That'd be the first step. I think in modernity, it also takes on a second meaning, which I don't like, which is the cutting off of the subject from the object. So in Kant's aesthetics, for example, aesthetics is all going on here. It's not going on out there. And then in Fried and Greenberg, I think it reverses. It's all out there. It's not here. And that's why Fried hates theatrical aesthetics. Anything theatrical is bad. And in formal ethics, of course, in Kant, I think it's the only place he uses the term formalism is in his ethics, not in the other parts. And formalism in ethics, of course, is the idea that it has nothing to do with the consequences or the content of the act. It has to do with following the pure formula of duty. And I think we would do well to get over that. I mean, the most powerful critique of Kant's ethics still was probably Max Scheler's. I know you like Hegel's, but Max Scheler's critique is that an ethics has to do with our love for something that we're passionate about, something that we are drawn to, and that we make a major topic of our lives. And so in a sense, the basic ethical unit is not us. The basic ethical unit is us plus what we love. This will be Scheler's position. And I tried to show this through a reading of Dante in my last book. This is what Dante is about as well. Dante is about an ethics of love. It's about your attachment to things. And what's the lowest sin in Dante? It's fraud, which is a false attachment. It's pretending to be attached to something that you're not, such as family or country or friends that you then betray.
So it's Trump. No,
Trump
would be the sinner for.
Where would you put Trump in the?
But isn't he a fraud exactly in this sense? He pretends America first and so on.
He's a fraud in almost every sense. But
yeah,
and what really, maybe I'll go off topic here, but I really need to say this to get it out of my system. We've known this guy for 30 some years, and we knew what a clown he is, and yet we elect him anyway after all this time. And I could see the American public going through a phase of thinking we need a businessman to fix everything. We had Perot in the early 90s. There was this kind of phenomenon. But he's not even a good businessman. He's made his business out of cheating people, out of shafting contractors and employees.
He seems to be a real estate developer, so maybe we.
Yeah, but I agree with you.
Maybe we can. How do you feel about opening it up to the audience?
But what he was doing was going from one bankruptcy to another,
exactly,
and somehow making the taxpayers pay for his debts and squeezing out. He's not what he pretends to be, a successful individual, big capitalist, and so on and so on.
And unlike you, I'm not optimistic that something good will come of this. I think so much damage could be done that there's not going to be a chance to do anything better. I think we're losing too many basic things, and that's why I went for Hillary, despite maybe not being my first
Hillary
choice.
For me is such a tragedy. Okay,
but could it preserve some things?
Maybe. Let's try. No, but sorry, just what you mentioned about what were you talking about just before this?
Symptoms. Capitalist symptoms.
Yeah, formalism and so on.
Yes.
But you know, I try to be also a formalist. I think all good Marxists are formalists in the sense that you don't project some social antagonism onto it. I think that, for example, that's how, at my best, which is not always the case, I dismiss many of my cinema analysis as just I use brutally examples to make a theoretical point, nothing to do with films. But sometimes when I write about Tarkovsky, about Hitchcock and so on, I try to be a formalist. I think that to get even at social context of Hitchcock, for example, for me, the supreme scene, the second murder of Detective Arbogast in Psycho, the way camera moves up and so on, you have an entire implicit theology and so on there. I think that for me, formalism and social analysis do not exclude themselves. Social analysis does not mean immediate content analysis, is the bourgeois a hero or whatever. And even with architecture, my God, you should like, Psycho is for me one of the great works about architecture, because the basic tension of the film is precisely horizontal, vertical. Mother's house, modeled on Edward, I think it was on Hopper or what, that Mother's house, and all those motels against, it's against two types of traditional Mother's house and modern flat motel, Bates Motel, So ironically, in my analysis of Psycho, I ask myself, because the whole tension of Norman Bates is, he's literally a guy caught between the two. Traditional architecture, mother's house, and modern hotel. But what if, because this is still a modernist opposition, what if we move into what, in popular terms, is called postmodernism, and imagine a motel which is itself flat but done with all the traditional kitsch ornaments, that you don't need mother's house up there. Mother house would be put as a mask on the motel itself. What would happen in that case with Norman Bates? You know, I rather don't think about it, right. You know. So just to avoid this, I deeply sympathize with your idea of formalism, that I am absolutely opposed to this vulgar reading of projecting some social content and so on and so on. All but great artists,
I think
formalists.
Your analysis of Tarkovsky, the slowing down of the frame, completely slowing down to beyond, it's a kind of slowing down of reality, which becomes its own mode of abstraction. That to me
that's a beautiful reading. I agree with you. But we talked before that.
I would like to open it up. Is it okay if we open it up to the audience? Maybe.
No, can I just add another
thing? Is there a microphone?
Very briefly. No? The way I would have answered you when you said reality and so on, we nonetheless, maybe this is our misunderstanding. Reality is constructed in the simple sense that what we perceive as social reality is different from one society, but I'm not a social constructivist. There is the real, there are traumas and so on. So my ultimate enemy even is this cheap deconstructionism, like everything is socially constructed. Yeah. We share this.
Except that the real is not reality and the objet is not my object. So we still have those differences.
Well, I will put it in this way to end up in a comical way. Leave this to the KGB unit that will investigate you to say what is your object. The party will look into it and inform you about it. Sorry, let's go. But you get the point how the two of us, we may appear totally opposed. And that's what I found. And all of a sudden, there are these unexpected interconnections and so on, which is why I agree with him precisely where he doesn't even agree with his own guys, like how you criticize Latour and all those relationists and insist on fixity, identity. That's absolutely crucial for me. And here you are, although you would kill me for saying this, a good Hegelian, as good readers of Hegel, like the friend Gerard Lebrun demonstrated. Hegel is absolutely not this kind of universal mobilist. Everything develops and so on and so on. Okay, stop.
But I still like the thing in itself, and you don't. That's a big difference.
I do, but I would redefine it as thing in itself, as you said, my God. It's not simply out there. It's in the cracks here and so on. You said this. You provided a wonderful formulation. Why also you are totally right, criticized Meillassoux. We don't arrive and think in itself by, you provided by abstracting and then trying how are things independently. I totally agree with you that the problem is that we are part of the thing itself. We are not here and thing itself is out there.
Are you talking about a kind of death of abstraction? I mean, is this...
No, we are all for abstraction. No, abstraction. And for me, as a Hegelian, again, abstraction is part of reality. Abstraction is not you move out of reality. That's the whole paradox. Reality can be abstract.
Then I stay on stage. Okay.
Sorry?
Then I will stay on stage.
Let it be. For some time, Central Committee allows you to... Now, you know, this is Stalinist opportunism. You are left-wing deviation, you are right-wing deviation, and I'm the party line making tactical alliances with Bukharin, with Trotsky.
Filling the bureaucracy.
Yeah, bureaucracy. Sorry, let's go on. But I cut you off. I feel you think have some final thought.
That I'm still more willing to do. I do think the thing in itself is out there. I just don't think it's knowable. So we do still disagree on that.
Yes, but again, the problem for me is that precisely as such, for example, let's take communism. At what level is for you communism a thing in itself?
The fact that communism is not completely actualized in any of its effects, or
I agree,
or in any of the components that build it up.
But isn't it that it is a thing in itself, but as such, it is in some sense the effect of people interacting?
Sure, every object is.
And then we agree. But go to but.
The but is this. The object is emergent. It isn't reducible to those pieces. It has,
absolutely agree.
So we agree about that.
As a good Hegelian, I absolutely agree. No, that's what Hegel calls idea. For Hegel, idea is not something, it's not a Platonic idea out there. And that's what Hegel makes it clear. I agree with you here. Nonetheless, we cannot simply say it's just a fetishized effect. All that really exists are human people, actual people. All this, I really dislike it, early Marx metaphorics of the only actual things are real people producing. No, in itself, although it doesn't exist as this concrete object, it also exists, it exerts causality, efficiency. I totally agree with you here. You wanted to say something?
I'm done.
We are so merciful, we even allow... No, sorry, but didn't you want to play democracy?
Didn't we do it? Did we not do this?
No, by democracy, I mean...
Yes. Does anybody want to ask a question?
Oh, boy.
Well, you know, for sake of time, I know you don't want to... you know, you need to go now too long after 8. I want to we're gonna skip the democracy portion. But
see, he would appreciate. He'll love this. So yeah, you don't need the democracy portion.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. I was actually thinking earlier. There's a kind of interesting echo between the way that he always plays with the rhetorical Stalinism and the Stalin references and the ways that our late friend Michael Brooks always used to sort of fondly bring up, you know, like third wave figures like Tony Blair, you know, that it was like, you know, in both cases, like there's definitely an element of fucking around, like that's definitely part of it. But I think in both cases, that's not the whole thing, you know, that there is some actual sense of, you know, affinity there.
Michael loved when Slavoj called him a Stalinist. I think Michael said something like, "Coming from you, that's the highest. That's the highest praise."
That's a good one. Yeah. One comment. Do you mind? Like, I don't know what stage our discussion is at. I just wanted to respond to something sort of in the comments people are getting at. Yep. Yeah, like I see this really. You know, I think one. You know, when I raised this point about strong and weak Marxism and the way it approaches these things, I mean, I think one thing that is characteristic of really most philosophy. Is that you know, we tend to think that, well, you know, if you're not taking the subject, right, you know, and sort of thought as the starting point of your analysis, that there's going to be some fundamental problem, right, because you're going to be presupposing something, right, that you know, establishing another constitutive principle that thought already has to mediate, right. And I mean, I guess I just find this sort of like an unsatisfactory kind of defense, because I think that for this to be true, we have to presuppose that thought isn't already conditioned by, for example, you know, more significant external variables in absolutely decisive ways, right? So I'm saying there's a difference between thought being, you know, an instrument which is, you know, that appears to us that we have, and it having a stable structure and being absolutely constitutive. Right. And so I think, you know, again, in terms of the way I approach this reconciliation of Marxism and epistemology, the way I would sort of approach it is in, you know, is it possible that the form of value, right, which sort of structures economic activity, right, which is a kind of dualism, right? You know, if you sleep with someone, that doesn't create value, but if you sleep with someone you charge, that creates value. Is it possible that the form of value and the structure of commodity exchange actually conditions, you know, Kant's pure categories of the understanding? And if that were true, can we really say that the best thing to do is just to start with thought, right? You know.
Yeah. By the way, I should say one thing that reminds me of is in the 2018 event with Žižek and Harman. There's the, you know, commodity fetishism is brought up as like a possible like Marxist criticism of object-oriented ontology, and it seemed like in that case, like Harman's response, which I think is fair enough as far as it goes, although I also wonder how that fits with other things that he said both there and here seem to be basically, well, it's not all or nothing, right? You can't, you don't have to, you don't have to be a realist about everything or about nothing. That you can. That like you can think that like value isn't a thing in itself, but but other things are, which maybe that's an oversimplification. But that's what I got out of what he said. Although that also, and I don't know, this doesn't directly address Conrad's point, and I don't want that point to get lost. But I also wonder, like, just on kind of a simple-minded level. Okay, if it's not everything or nothing, which I agree, right? Like there's no reason it would be. Then why are we insisting on there being like an essence of like an interesting explanatory essence of Jewishness or Egyptianness or Norwegianness?
Mm-hmm.
Like it seems like you could have all the object ontology you want without bringing that in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But if you want to address what Conrad was saying.
Yeah, well, I think he said it pretty well.
Yeah.
I'm trying to. Well, actually, Conrad, can you articulate that point again about commodity fetishism and like sort of just
not commodity fetishism, right? But I'm thinking here of Alfred Sohn-Rethel's text, Intellectual and Manual Labor, which Žižek actually discusses in The Sublime Object of Ideology. And I think Žižek's discussion of it is part of why it has a certain popularity. But I mean, I like, if I'm not mistaken, I think what happens in this book is essentially Sohn-Rethel's argument is that if you look at the categories which Kant, the pure categories of the understanding, and you look at the way that he applies these, that there is a sort of that its structure fundamentally comes from the process of commodity exchange, right?
Okay. Right.
So if you look at like the idea of he talks about the significance of inertia to modern science and how Kant was kind of animated by this, because he's looking at someone like Newton and he's saying, well, it's clear that not everything that is applied in Newtonian science is just kind of empirically there, right? And he's like, how does something like the principle of inertia, which has no, simple kind of immediate reference point, how does this emerge? And this is, a problem that someone like Althusser, I don't think, resolves satisfactorily. But what Sohn-Rethel argues, for instance, is that the principle of inertia is, connected to this notion that of commodity exchange, right? This object, this discrete object that's kind of moving, right? That's not being interrupted in this way, right? Or that, an external force has to sort of stop it, right? But I think you can kind of go further and say, like, well, Heidegger points out that the notion of subject, right, that's developed throughout modern philosophy, that it doesn't begin actually referring to subjectivity as we understand it, that it starts out and it's referring to, like the Milesian philosophers, like all is water, right? And those Milesian philosophers, right, the beginning of philosophy, when they're trying to locate a single constituent substance, right, that structures reality, they're doing that just as money is being introduced to those societies.
Right. Okay. I see. Yeah.
Yeah. So is it possible in a way, and in my own work, I've carried this argument forward, but is it possible that what we call the subject in enlightenment isn't like, if substance is value or money, right? Is it possible that what we call the subject of enlightenment can only happen once labor becomes a commodity, right? Because then the subject, becomes the substance, right? And that kind of frames enlightenment thought. I mean, when you start to look at it this way, it just seems to me to be maybe problematic. The way that in philosophy we tend to think, well, if you want to be a rigorous philosopher, you always just, the grounding principle, right, should be sort of subjectivity in thought. Sorry, Ben, I didn't want to drag that down a really esoteric kind of hole, but you're muted, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say no. I don't have a lot to say about it, but I would, interested.
I would just add, this is also in Sublime Object of Ideology, but Hegel kind of has a pre-Marxian answer to this, and it's Hegel, and he gets this term from Kant, but it's the infinite judgment. And if people are interested in this, they can look at the last chapter, the final chapter of the Sublime Object of Ideology, which I think is titled not only is subject but also substance, that classic Hegel line. But Hegel has this infinite judgment where he says wealth is the self. And that's kind of like, that's the sort of Marxist articulation of, I think, exactly what you're talking about there, Conrad. So like, once again, I was on a panel last week and somebody said, like, you can find pretty much anything you want somewhere in Hegel. And I think that's it's a good illustration of it. But
well, he also says that Hegel also says in the Science of Logic, in like the early part of the Science of Logic, he says that like basically you couldn't have philosophy or anything like it, until, let's say, like ancient Egypt, right? When there was, and I'm going to approximate, but when there was basically sort of appropriation of surplus products so that people could just sit around all day being like, what is the meaning of the world, right? So, and this is actually sort of repeated by Marx in the German ideology. I don't know if it's a direct debt to it. But yeah, you do get these wonderful little proto-Marxist elements of Hegel that are quite fun to kind of find.
Yeah, right. Well, that's probably another thing that that's the right. That's like you can adapt Serge's line about Bolshevism, Stalinism too. That they're the germs of that, but also the germs of a lot of other things.
Yeah.
In Hegel, but I am interested in our last few minutes together in trying to like zoom out a little bit and try to think. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff that was covered here. All of it interesting. Harman, if you're watching, DM me. We'll get you on the show sometime to get your perspective on this. Serious offer, but in any case, and obviously it's they covered everything from Stalinist architecture to to the Battle of Gettysburg, and there were tons of nuggets in there that are interested in themselves. It's obviously I think that. It's always incredibly entertaining, to watch Žižek talk and connect things in the way that he does, and it's often like really interesting insights, in those connections, and certainly interviewed him here. I think that was one of the best episodes we did, but and Harman, who I've seen much less of, but I've seen this now, and I saw the 2018 event, and and I think he's a very I think he's like a really admirably clear thinker, and he's connecting a lot of interesting dots. So I mean, I think even sort of separate from the bigger picture, I mean, this was an interesting one to watch, but I do want to try to think a little bit about that bigger picture, right? About like what's ultimately being argued about, like what's in dispute between these two guys. So if like one way to think about this is is that Harman is maybe in materialist in a more direct and obvious sense than Žižek in terms of his beliefs about material objects, even if that doesn't connect to the sort of more politically interesting senses of materialism you were talking about. And he's certainly a realist. That's the beginning of everything for him, and so he thinks that it's very important that our understanding of the world be horizontal, that they're objects, and human psyches are objects that exist the same way that quasars and cats exist. And there may be lots of interesting or distinctive things about human psyches, but we don't want to start with that. When we sort of do our initial inventory of reality, we want to kind of put everything on the same level. And as tempting as it would be to sort of go back and ask a bunch of follow-up questions about that, like kind of quick and dirty summary of Harman. And I think that some of the things that people are raising in chat about how that might relate to different sort of, different ways of understanding, physicalism, or reductive, non-reductive views about metaphysics. I'm not going to give up into that temptation now because I don't want to keep us for too much longer. So let's just stick with that quick and dirty understanding of Harman. So Harman's initial understanding, at least certainly, of what's at dispute between him and Žižek on that big picture level is, look, so the thing that you and Žižek wrote was subject lessons. You're obviously very interested in subjects, and Harman at least seems to interpret that as meaning that you think that that human subjectivity is metaphysically basic in a way that it's not, according to object-oriented ontology. So at the I guess just to sort of go at this directly, Russ, is this what's your sense of the way that what would be a way from your perspective to summarize ways that Žižek might have complicated or pushed back against that idea of what they disagree with in what we just watched, or just to put the question differently, what's the what do you think what do you think Harman's understanding of what the gap between them is? Is that to what extent is that accurate? What do you think that maybe he's missing or getting wrong?
Well, actually it's interesting because in the 2018 debate, which is more like it's more like Harman gives a talk and then Žižek responds, but Harman mentions this. I think that he does not, and we're going to take this up in our response to his review, basically of our subject lessons collection. But he does not. He calls this I forget what the exact term he uses. Not an evasion, but an alibi, I think is the term he uses. Žižek's answer would be that, and he gestures toward it. I mean, not gestures. He says it explicitly, but he's in that debate. But he has talked about it and written about it at greater lengths elsewhere. That subject is not. Žižek would insist on the decoupling of human being and subject, and that subject is an inhuman excessive element that is born out of it comes from a human being, but it's not it's irreducible to human being. And Harman doesn't buy that for any number of reasons. And one of the examples that he cites is in an interview that he did with Quentin Meillassoux in a book that Harman wrote on Meillassoux, and the final chapter is an interview that he did. And Meillassoux makes this point about Lacanian arguments and says that not just Lacan but also Alain Badiou, who was his advisor, that if you're talking about a chair and wobbliness of the chair, okay, the chair is wobbly, but it still is the wobbliness is a characteristic of the chair. And he says that attempts to try to do this with subjectivity, to say that, okay, the locus of subjectivity doesn't exist at the level of cogito where it did for Descartes. For Lacan, it's the unconscious. And he basically says, he calls this a wobbly subject. And Meillassoux says, but the wobbliness is still in relation to a subject. And I think that despite their disagreements, Harman's and Meillassoux, that Harman would more or less agree with that. And I do not think that, I think there is a gap between subject and human that has to be decoupled. And I also think that the last thing I would say is that the point, my biggest problem with object-oriented ontology is that I think its greatest sort of promise is that it has this sort of anthropocentric politics. So like climate change, for instance, right? I mean, which is, man-made. But I think that the decentering of human being, I don't think this sort of modesty, I don't think that that's a way to achieve or to like save the world, or to, I don't think that it's a very, efficacious political project when it translates from the philosophical to the political. But there's so much more I could say. I'm just going to leave it there.
Should I?
Yeah, go for it.
Yep. For me, I guess I think there's the problem for me kind of with Harman's work is there's this weird tension between realism and phenomenal designation, right? So he'd be and I don't know, maybe I'm not doing great justice to the genius of Harman, who I kind of like because he's a more brilliant version of the dad from Family Guy. He reminds me of that. What I like, I think if you look at this, so Harman will say, on one hand, we shouldn't overmine or undermine objects. I have sort of this realist frame. But on the other hand, it seems when he talks about something like overmining or undermining, that it can't really function without just indexing to a somewhat arbitrary sort of phenomenal context. I mean, I think if you actually trace this back, I think that this problem is really a problem of Husserl, right? Because when Husserl kind of starts out, his phenomenological method, where we go to logical investigations, there's this sort of grandiose promise of, and it's a great idea, right? If you look at eidetic reduction, this idea that, objectivity emerges within subjectivity, right? This is what he's trying to get at. But as Husserl sort of progresses, right, as you get through, ideas 1, ideas 2, he takes on more of a sort of subjectivist frame, right? So there were certain sort of, apostate Husserlians who described themselves as realist phenomenologists and kind of took the stance that, you can identify, objects in this sort of way, which I think is interesting. But I guess what I mean is that, I don't think that ever fully succeeds, right? And I think at the same time though, and I do have to say this, I think at the same time though, I have I have reservations about Žižek's program. I think Žižek's a brilliant philosopher. I think maybe methodically or systemically, he's more lucid than Harman in some ways. But I just think, and this is actually, I think, the problem in a way with Adrian Johnston, right, is he wants to sort of revive dialectical materialism, right? This is sort of what he's purporting to do in his Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic. And I think Johnston's really, really correct, in that first volume when he says, look, it's not, we can't just make materialism a mathematical reductionism, right? It can't just be
Right.
the math theme. It can't just be, set theory, right? As in Badiou. It can't just be, the application of set theory and aleatory reasoning we find in Mesu. I think that's a really good gesture. The only problem is I don't see how, if you look at the actually quite good, but still second volume of that trilogy where Johnston goes, I mean, he's mostly just supplying examples of, the domain of biology, for example, or more sort of physicalist examples, and then locating, the role of ontological negativity within them, right? And I also wonder about this kind of as an approach to science, because it seems to me like he cites Stephen Jay Goulding, is that it, right? Stephen Jay Gould, yeah, sorry. In his work on evolutionary theory. And Gould obviously stresses the role of contingency, right, in evolution. But then I think I read an interesting study that was done by someone else, and they're like, oh, well, if you look at bacteria, right, as a variable factor in evolution, it's quite possible that a lot of the examples of contingency that Gould is trotting out are not necessarily so contingent as they seem. Right. So if you're just going to say oh, well, the world has some kind of ontological negativity, don't you risk in a way being okay, we can't explain that. That's just ontologically negative. It's just contingent. Right. I mean, where do you kind of, because you're having to make negativity part of reality. Right. And at what point can that ever be a prescription for any kind of realism? So there's an uncomfortable tension, I think, between phenomenal designation and realism there as well. But hey, this is the oldest, this is one of the oldest conundrums of philosophy, right? It's like, how do we access the world, right, from our minds?
So I think one of the first things that you said in all of that was that you think that Harman's thing about not undermining or overmining, which maybe I'm fixated on because I it's one of the parts of this I feel like I have the best grasp on, is that it relies on this kind of arbitrary phenomenal position. So I guess first let me make sure I understand what you mean by that, right? So if the idea is like, okay, that we have, we think that tables, or for that matter the Dutch East India Company, really exist, and can't be reduced to more basic units, or reduced to more general units, that'd be the overmining, then that's because it's the sort of thing that these are the sorts of things that we interact with as humans, right? That's the Klein line about mid-sized dry goods. And if that is what you mean, right, that it's sort of because that's from our perspective, those are things that we kind of group together as objects. I guess I'm not sure how much that undermines his claim there, because it seems like, I think, consistent with everything that he's saying, right? Because it's not like he wants to say that sure, the Dutch East India Company exists, but so do all the employees of the Dutch East India Company. The table exists, but so do the LIGs, and for that matter, the quantum particles, that make them up. So it seems like it could be that you just have really existing objects on all sorts of levels. So you have the quantum particles, you have the tables and chairs, and Dutch East India Company, but you also probably have like really existing objects that are on some sort of in between level that that humans never have any occasion to notice or interact or think about, and presumably you also have like objects that are or you certainly could have objects that are made up, that like humans never have any occasion to interact with or think about, so we wouldn't even think of as objects, but that might very well like check all of his boxes for counting as objects. That I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking to hear about like the mereological fusion of like the chair and the like the chair that I'm sitting on at the Dutch East India Company, and whatever, and like from our human perspective, like that's not anything we would think of as an object, but maybe we could come up with some sort of fanciful hypothetical beings that would interact with it in some way that they think of it as an object. Well, that last part was went off the rails a little bit, but whatever. But like
not really, but
okay, maybe not, right? So and I think that might all be consistent with this program, that that you could say, yeah, because after all, if like the starting point of all, okay, so I guess maybe like this might be a pithier way to make the point. If Conrad thinks that maybe one way of making Conrad's point is to say, is there a tension here between saying that humans aren't special, which is surely like if there's anything that's animating, what Harman's doing here, that's it. And saying that it's very important to be realists about these objects that like make sense as objects from a human perspective. And then I guess my answer on behalf of him is maybe there's not a tension there, because you could say, yeah, sure, the things that we, the objects that sort of we notice from our perspective, the tables and the chairs and countries and all that stuff exist, but that doesn't mean that lots of other objects at different levels might exist that that we don't notice.
Yeah,
from our phenomenal perspective. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And unless you had anything else on that, Russell, before we ended, I did want to go back to what you were saying about the political upshot, because I don't know. I mean, I wonder if there is a political upshot at all, actually, like, which is not a diss, right? I mean, like, I have absolutely nothing against, thinking about abstract philosophical questions for their own sake. I would say, in fact, that in some ways, not only do they not have to earn their keep by being relevant to politics, but that in some ways it's kind of the other way around. That I think that this is kind of what I said in the Quentin Smith article, that one of the things that politics is for is freeing people up to spend more time thinking about things like this, along with creating art and everything else. That I want a society where people who have philosophical inclinations have more time to worry about metaphysics, because they're spending less time worried about their health insurance and paying their bills. But that said, like, is that something that that Harman or his co-thinkers think of as one of the big benefits of object-oriented ontology, that it would somehow be conducive to better politics on climate change? Because that seems super dubious to me.
One of the things that I appreciate most about Harman is that he foregrounds aesthetics, which I think is somebody coming from the field of literature I appreciate, and his politics are not central to his work in the way that other people within this constellation, who've been mentioned earlier, Jane Bennett, and particularly Bennett and Levi Bryant, they really foreground the sort of political promise or the political sort of implications of a flat ontology, but it's not as explicit in Harman.
Yeah, because okay, that's makes me like it better, because I think that it's like to me that almost sounds like a category mistake, saying that whether we think that that there's some abstract metaphysical sense in which in which subjects or human subjects, I know you think those come apart, that's but that whether there's some abstract metaphysical sense in which human subjectivity is more basic or not, than other kinds of objects. That just seems like a completely unrelated question from any sort of ethical issue about how we should treat the non-human, the non-human natural world. I mean, you could say, I mean, and the other way around too, right? I mean, surely surely whatever you think about whether whether human, even if you think that there's some sense in which whatever, quantum particles are more basic and explanatory than tables or chairs in the Dutch East India Company, it doesn't follow from that we don't have moral obligations to human beings.
Yeah.
So it seems really unlikely that it would follow from anything about of human subjecthood not being metaphysically primary, that there's some sort of should lurking, that just seems like a weird is-ought confusion to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and actually, it's interesting. So I would say that I'm quite, I'm sympathetic with object-oriented ontology to a degree. I think mostly because, if you look at kind of my own work and my own project, I approach, dualism through the form of value, but I still treat it as something that has to be sort of superseded, right, where that should be. So I'm not so fast to kind of go and say, okay, well, let's just start kind of designating these things right now, right? But I have a similar kind of problem that way. But some people have criticized how the political application of this sometimes plays out. So I know one thing that I think is kind of funny is it Vibrant Matter by Jane Bennett? Have you guys read that? Whether you read Vibrant Matter? Yeah. Do you remember that part? Is it in Vibrant Matter or another essay or something? But there's something Jane Bennett writes, and she talks about some years ago, was it 2003? I forget. There was a big power outage in California. And she talks about the idea that well, maybe if we're really going to apply, this sort of, I can't really express Jane Bennett, systematically, but this more vitalistic kind of analysis, that we shouldn't necessarily blame, the corporation that was supposed to be providing this, right, for being delinquent in some way, but that we should actually, look at all the sort of electrical parts and receptors, and we should look at sort of their status as actants in a kind of way. And then that's kind of like, well, like, I don't know if it works that way. You know?
That's an evacuation of the political, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
We could keep going. We could keep going until it's late here. Never mind in Paris, where it's already very late.
What is it? 2:30 for you?
2:32. Yeah.
Wow.
I stay up late normally. It's okay.
I was gonna say you're astonishingly coherent. That's at 2:32, but
not coherent enough for everyone in the audience, but I am trying. It's a tough job you have, I got to tell you.
Fair enough. Well, look, let's. I want to give people a chance to. I know that a lot's been covered here, and there are lots of threads that that I don't think we have or probably could in one session. Follow all of them, but I do. I should say, by the way, that in not very many weeks, Conrad is going to be on the main show because when Jordan Peterson's new book comes out, figured that would be a good time to talk about bring all the authors of Myth and Mayhem on to talk about that. Russ, no immediate plans. Although as we were talking tonight, it actually occurred. I was thinking about this. Kant comes up in some way every time I talk to you, and so I think it might be fun to at some point do like we had a couple weeks ago the Thursday essay for patrons was Gene Bajalan giving a beginner's guide to Kurdistan, and I think it would actually be I think it'd be fun to have you and one of the guests maybe for like a Thursday episode to do a beginner's guide to Kant.
Yeah, I'm down.
All right, let's do it. But all right, so anyway, we want to go get off. So his people have plans for the night. Some of us have not eaten yet. Some of us are living in time zones where it's the middle of the night. So quick final thoughts about the debate, and then we'll sign off for tonight.
I mean, I just want to say that I appreciate Harman very much, and I'm not being it's not like a superficial or sort of polite thing. And I think if you watch the Q&A too, and of this from this debate or this discussion, and the other one from 2018, that Žižek says the same. If for no other reason than that, the debate about big ontological questions, Žižek and Harman both agree that this is where philosophy should be headed, or what. And so I think that it's you don't really need I think Žižek says this at one point to Harman at the end, like who needs friends when you have enemies like these, right?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Please, Conrad.
So the first thing, just before I said anything, I just wanted to mention as well, in our it'll appear on the YouTube channel of Elliot Rosenstock. But if I'm not mistaken, in 2 days also we'll be discussing whether there's something that the American left can learn from China and vice versa. So some political stuff. So again, check out Elliot Rosenstock's YouTube channel, and that'll be happening in the afternoon in EST Tuesday. And I just wanted to say though about this, I met Bruno Latour as well, because I live in Paris, and I went to see some of his final lectures actually before he retired. I was happy I caught them at Sciences Po. And we had a brief exchange, and I expressed a certain admiration of some of his ideas. I do think they're very interesting. And Latour said something to me I thought was really interesting, and I'm just going to paraphrase it because I don't even remember exactly what it was, but he said something like, I said, I think your ideas are good or something. And he said, well, it's not hard to be good. He said something like, it's not hard to be good when you're right. Or like, it's like, or you're maybe it was like when you're on the right side of history or something like this. But I understood what he was actually sort of trying to say. And I think, one thing about, you look at our current situation, our world, obviously, like there's a huge crisis, in terms of the capacity of capitalist economies. One could go further and say like the form of value to cope with, these social crises. And I think the environment is maybe the biggest problem we're facing. But COVID itself is not divorceable from these environmental concerns, right? So I think that this sort of gesture that that people like Latour and Harman are trying to accomplish in going beyond sort of dual substance theory, I think there are lots of problems in the way it's formulated, but I think the basic idea is very futuristic and interesting. And I think we should maybe sometimes people I know in philosophical circles, they really say, well, these guys are not rigorous enough or whatever. And that as it may be, I mean, if you look at people in the past, like, philosophers who had a great influence, right? I mean, we could talk about like, Rousseau or something like that, right? It's like, it's not that they were necessarily the most rigorous people in the world, right? It's that they were responding to, social dilemmas, right? That were very, very important to respond to, right? And they were creating ideas that were appropriate to their time. And that's always difficult, right? When you get into that and try to do it.
Yeah.
So that's, I just want to say that I have this appreciation for this, even if I will criticize.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Yeah, and I think the last point is good. That rigor is an important value, but it's not an end in itself. That you and thinking that it is how you end up with a lot of incredibly uninteresting academic writing. But which is I think where analytic philosophy sometimes goes wrong, which is a whole subject for another time. But we really do need to wrap it there. So thank you so much, Russ and Conrad. Thank you everybody who's watching and keeping us company and asking questions in the chat. And I will see people back here tomorrow night at 7:30 with Michael Albert.